Hey guys, how are you all? Welcome back to my channel. If you enjoy, then please like, share and do comments. A large desolate barren landscape stretched outwards for miles upon miles. Barren, charred and burnt trees stood like sentry skeletons, their lifeless limbs stretching towards the endless expanse of the bloodied red sky. A single wind drew its breath across the landscape as the sands slowly shifted under its unguided movements. 9 separate bodies lay strewn across the landscape. Black cloaks surrounded them, hiding the limpness of their deceased bodies. Amid the death, a single figure stood. A long crimson cloak billowed around his form. A long trailing ribbon flowed from his left bicep. The cloth was a deep black, its ribbon flecked with fresh and dried blood. A metal plate was attached to the cloth. The metal plate bore a symbol similar to a leaf. This symbol was the mark of a village known as Konohagakure no Sato. The village hidden in the leaves. This symbol had a single line drawn through it. This line represented more than anyone would care to comprehend. The figure was tall. His red, nearly maroon, hair flowed gently in the breeze. Blood flowed freely from a large gash on his stomach. His bare chest glowed in a faint red glow from a design drawn on his navel. The glow was a stark, bright, boiling red. It emanated from the seal drawn on the man's skin. This seal contained a beast of immense power, a beast known only as the Kyuubi no Kitsune. In the hand of the man was a long katana. Blood slowly flowed in runnels down the blade. On his back was a large sword wrapped in bandages. On his left was the hilt of a sword, decorated in gold and emerald. However, no blade was attached. The man's cold midnight blue eyes surveyed the landscape. As he stood, the wind slowly died out. The man was having an internal conversation. It's finally over. All of it. They're all gone. Every last one. We can all rest in peace. A deep rumbling voice from within the glowing red seal responded. Such a shame there isn't anyone left to revel in your glory, isn't it, Kit? The man gave a small smile. Still so cynical, Kyuubi? Even in death I guess our old habits don't die. The voice gave a low rumbling chuckle. I suppose you're right. There isn't anything left. No Akatsuki, no Konoha, no one. The man, whose name was Uzumaki Naruto, allowed a single tear to fall. Crying was not a luxury he had allowed himself during the battle. Have you ever stopped to wonder how many people died because of what you did? How much was lost? Naruto closed his eyes as images flashed through his mind. The cheerful eye smile of his sensei, Hitaki Kakashi. The smiling face of Haruno Sakura. The gluttonous grin of Akamichi Choji. The lazy disinterested stare of Nara Shikamaru. The shy sparkling eyes of Hyuga Hinata. The stoic face of Aburame Shino. The boasting cheerful visage of Inuzuka Kiba. The slightly disapproving, but kind, glare of Yamanaka Ino. The stoic fate-obsessed persona of Hyuga Neji. The exuberant and excited Rock Lee. The smiling Hiroshi Tenten. The cheerful eye of the Sandame Hokage. The drunk sleeping form of Tsunade, the Godem Hokage. The motherly yelling picture of Shizune. The bearded and smoking Sarutobi Asuma. The bright red glistening eyes of Yuhi Kurenai. The many faces of the citizens of Konoha. The hundreds of thousands of people across the elemental countries who had been killed in the rampage of the Akatsuki. Too much. Kyuubi nodded. Those 2 words held so much within them, that it was nearly impossible to comprehend what they truly meant to him. The Kyuubi listened as Naruto began to speak once more. I suppose that it's time I held up my end of the bargain, isn't it, Kyuubi? The Kyuubi blinked. It hadn't truly expected him to be willing to release him, even after it was all said and done. And release me to what? This giant endless wasteland? So I can watch for millions of years as you beasts rise from nothingness once more? No thanks. Instead, how about I help you out one more time? Naruto didn't know how to respond. In his 26 years of life, he had never expected something like this to happen. I don't see how, Kyuubi. But, if you want to, I don't think there's much I can do to stop you. The Kyuubi grinned within its cage. I'm doing this because I won't be able to come with you. I'll be lost forever. But at least you won't be. I promised myself I wouldn't tell you this, but I've come to see you as somewhat as my successor. Naruto was speechless. The Kyuubi thought that highly of him? Now I want you to fix all this. When I come back again, I want it to be in a world worth living. Before Naruto could ask exactly what he was going to do, a bright red and blue light engulfed him. The last thing he remembered before losing consciousness was a white stucco ceiling and pale canary yellow walls, and an uncomfortable bed and a lumpy pillow underneath his head. The Sandaime Hokage stood over a small futon in a small dilapidated apartment. The white stucco ceiling was cracked and breaking, and the pale yellow walls were fading in color and sported several large holes. A rickety table stood on a peeling linoleum floor, a wheezing and coughing refrigerator stood near it. The counter was rotted and dirty and the stovetop was cracked and broken in many places. The sink was dented and rusted in many areas. The carpet was thin and worn and had been beaten through in several places, leaving large holes in the fabric. The window panes were dark and smudged, and the wood paneling was thick and peeling with absorbed water. As Sarutobi observed these things, he couldn't help but feel at least a little bit responsible. Although Sarutobi had tried to prevent the mistreatment of Naruto, there was very little that he could do. When he had been younger, Naruto has frequently received beatings and attacks. They lessened as he grew older, and soon only drunks and vagrants attacked him. The drunks usually in some misplaced anger over the same event that drove them to end up pissed drunk in the first place, and the vagrants thinking maybe he had something worth a bit of cash on him. However, a mob of some sort usually formed on the 10th of October. These mobs weren't those that involved the whole town. Mostly just a decent-sized group of those who had just lost a fortune on some form of betting, just won a fortune on some form of betting, those who were drunk off their rockers, and those who simply had nowhere else to go. These mobs came together for a single intent and purpose: the death of one Uzumaki Naruto. Now, these mobs never made much progress. As soon as someone started chanting, "Kill the demon," they were being tracked by Anbu. And as soon as someone stated the name, Uzumaki Naruto, as the intended recipient of the mob's misdirected feelings, they themselves became recipients of their own intents. The Third's decree was swiftly executed with extreme prejudice in the village of Konoha. The boy, Naruto, was under the protection of the decree, which read as follows: any person or entity, other than Uzumaki Naruto, who chooses to reveal the secret of the containment of the Kyuubi no Kitsune within Uzumaki Naruto will suffer from the highest form of capital punishment under the orders of the Third Hokage for reasons of subterfuge, treason, revealing level S-class village secrets, and endangerment of civilians and shinobi. Any person may be redeemed from this punishment only under the request of Uzumaki Naruto. Any citizen of Konoha seen or noted as mistreating, or acting in prejudice, against Uzumaki Naruto will suffer from a monetary penalty or carnal penalty depending on the severity of the action. Any citizen seen committing an act of aggression or violence against Uzumaki Naruto, with the intent to severely harm, injure, wound, or kill Uzumaki Naruto will suffer from the same punishment as revealing the secret. This decree may only be repealed by the will of Uzumaki Naruto, or in the event of his death, the current Hokage. Signed, Sarutobi Sasuke, the third Hokage. The death toll in Konoha had risen a striking 57% after the issuing of the decree. Most of these deaths were from misguided and misdirected souls who were attempting to kill Naruto in order to act out some form of vengeance against the beast who had demolished part of their beloved village. The other part originated from assassination attempts. These attempts often came from Iwa or Kumo, two shinobi villages that Konoha was not on good terms with. However, in each attempt, the assassin held no ties with any village, and there was no paper trail leading back to a possible source. However, Konoha suffered several budget deficiencies shortly after attempt. It was labeled as a filing error or a misjudgment about how much things purchased had actually cost. There was never anything to link anyone back to the scene. Sarutobi had done all that he could to prevent things like that from occurring once more. However, Sarutobi ran an entire village. He could delegate tasks to subordinates, but plenty of things required his signature, and nowadays Sarutobi was forced to carefully read through every document quite carefully. Gone were the carefree days of simply signing every paper that passed through his office, and only briefly checking over important documents. Many attempts had been made by several factions within Konoha, such as the Merchants Guild, the Shop Owners Union, the Stall Owners Guild, had all tried to slip things past him hidden within documents. What originally seemed like a formal request to change the kind of wood used in certain umbrellas on the stalls, a relatively minor issue, contained an article requesting that stall owners be granted the right to charge extra to orphans and disadvantaged citizens if they so chose, and the right to harm said individuals should they disagree with the price without fear of any legal retribution. Meaning, if they wanted to, they could charge Naruto as much as they wanted for any of their merchandise, and if he made any sort of complaint about it, they could kill him. Needless to say, that particular request was destroyed. Although Sarutobi had done as much as he possibly could, it wasn't really that much. He stopped by to visit Naruto on his birthday, of course, but then again he did that for all the orphans that he could. However, Naruto was the only orphan who he currently did such a thing for. All the other orphans had other caretakers who took over that responsibility, or they were quickly adopted into a family. But beyond that simply pleasure, Sarutobi was extremely limited in what he could do for the boy. He couldn't take care of a boy Naruto's age. He was far too busy with his duties as Hokage, and his son Asuma was too busy to take care of a child. As such, Sarutobi was forced to interact as little as possible with Naruto. However, whenever he had a few spare hours, Naruto was always there to fill that gap. He provided Naruto with a weekly orphan stipend provided to all orphans living on their own after the age of 5. However, it didn't amount to much. Sarutobi had placed Naruto in one of the tenements specifically reserved for orphans such as him, but he hadn't anticipated the rest of the tenement being deserted. There wasn't much that Sarutobi could do beyond what he had already. The boy had a sizable amount of money left from the stipends he had saved. Unfortunately, this was due to many shopkeepers exercising their right to refuse service to anyone they chose. Those that didn't refuse him service offered him only low-quality goods. These ranged from near-rotting foods or expired milk, to low-quality clothing. The orange jumpsuit Naruto always wore was in fact originally sold as Tundra Climate Rescue uniform. The thick padding offered layers of warmth, while the bright color was an easily visible signal in thick white snow. However, it didn't sell particularly well in Konoha. The shopkeepers, however, turned this to their advantage by offering it as the only item in a market available to Uzumaki Naruto. Sarutobi sighed as he watched the peaceful boy slumbering on the futon before him. He had come to speak to Naruto about him attempting the genin exam the next day. It was unusual to say the least for a 10-year-old child to even attempt the exam. In this story, it follows canon as Naruto being 12 when he graduates. He wanted to let Naruto know that he wouldn't be disappointed if he didn't pass the exam. Sarutobi had no doubts that Naruto couldn't pass the exam, but the exam given to early graduates was intentionally slanted to discourage them from graduating. This helped to promote mental stability and emotional maturity before graduation. Those that did manage to pass the test despite all the deterrents in place truly deserved their spot as shinobi of Konoha. Unfortunately, many early graduates suffered from mental instability. Uchiha Itachi and Orochimaru were two examples. Kakashi had his own personal quirks, but he wasn't on the level of mental deterioration that Itachi and Orochimaru were. Sarutobi was snapped out of his reverie as the body in front of him started to move. Naruto opened his eyes slowly as they adjusted the dim glare of the light of his small apartment. He gave a slight groan as he came back to reality. The last thing he could remember was the Kyuubi's dark laughter as descended into the red vortex. He had no idea where he was, but he had a feeling that it wasn't a place he really wanted to be. As he thought through his next move, a voice Naruto thought he would never hear again registered in his mind. "Naruto-kun, are you alright? You seem a bit restless." Naruto stopped moving. That voice. It couldn't be. But, he was killed years ago. How can he still be here? "Are you okay? You seem jittery." The aged Hokage's voice broke him out of the spell. "Gigi? Is it really you, Gigi?" Sarutobi looked down at the small boy that looked up at him with large watery tear-filled eyes. Sarutobi had no idea what was causing Naruto's emotional mood, just that he needed to be comforted. "Yes, Naruto, it really is me. I'm here. What's the problem? Did you have a bad dream or something?" Naruto sobbed quietly into the Hokage's shoulders. He lifted his head at the Hokage's reassurance that he was real. It was all too surreal for him. The Sandaime Hokage was alive. You could say that, Gigi. I thought that you had died. It was all so real." Naruto paused for a second to think. Was he dreaming? Or had he simply dreamed the war between Oto and Konoha? Had he just made up all those people? Were they all just figments of his imagination? He had one way to test it. He had to ask the Hokage the day. If it was the day after his genin exam, great. That meant it was all a dream. If it wasn't, then Naruto had some serious thinking to do. Gigi, what day is it? The Hokage looked surprised that he would ask such a question. It's April 23rd. Tomorrow is the Genin graduation exam. You've been asking about it for a while, and as much as I want to, I can't prevent you from taking it early. You're only 10, but you're also your own legal guardian. I just wanted to make sure you understood just how big of a step this is. If you pass this test, you'll legally be considered an adult in Konoha. You'll be able to drink, smoke, publicly carry and/or display weapons, and you'll be allowed into the more adult establishments. Sarutobi cleared his throat at Naruto's incredulous expression. This talk hadn't happened the first time he had run through this timeline. Not that I expect you to participate in that sort of thing. Anyways, I just hope you understand what you may be getting yourself into. Naruto smiled at Sarutobi's kind and caring words. He had missed the comfort that his grandfather figure had provided before his untimely demise at the hands of a certain snake-sawing traitor. It's all right, Gigi. I understand the responsibilities that come with being a genin of Konoha. Sarutobi smiled. So I presume you're going to wait the extra 2 years for supplementary academy training and try again later? Sarutobi breathed an internal sigh of relief. Not having to worry about Naruto being a genin for another 2 years was a weight off his shoulders. Hell no, I'm taking it tomorrow. You just watch me, Gigi. I'll be the greatest genin that Konoha has ever seen. The weight that had just been lifted from Sarutobi came crashing back down. I'm sure you will, Naruto. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have preparations to make for the new class of incoming genin. However, Sarutobi's thoughts at that moment were far from deciding which genin would be assigned to which sensei. He was focused on Naruto's statement. As he left the small apartment building, he remembered Naruto's words, "I'll be the greatest genin Konoha has ever seen." Under his breath he spoke quietly to himself. And that's exactly what I'm afraid of, Naruto. Naruto sat on his futon, alone. The Sandaime had left a few minutes ago, leaving the apartment nearly empty and devoid of life. Naruto had some thinking and planning to do. He stood up, gave a stretch to work out the soft muscles in his arms. He really had to get back into shape. Even if he was only 10 years old, he was still quite weak, and probably indefinitely slow too. Sighing, he walked to the small room he used as a bedroom. There, he rummaged through an old shelf before pulling out a slightly dusty, but fairly well taken care of, scroll. On the small writing desk he found a large pile of empty ramen cups, dirty clothes, and old sheets of paper. Doing the intelligent thing, he simply shoved it all off of the desk into a corner. Luckily, an unopened ink well still rested in the corner of his desk. Atop the small cabinetry on the desk he found a black quill. Opening the scroll, he unstopped the ink well and dipped the quill into it. He would have preferred a brush, but this plain script, not calligraphy or kanji. However, his years of extensive work in seals had driven a deep comfort of using a brush into him. Despite his slight discomfort at using a quill, Naruto quickly began writing things out, speaking to himself as he often did while he worked. Alright, let's see. Apparently Kyuubi's jutsu worked and I've been sent back to a time where I'm 10 years old. Fun. He quickly wrote down a note at the top of the scroll. Arrived at 10 years of age. Physical condition. Deplorable. Body has little muscle mass and is severely malnourished. Most likely surviving off Kyuubi's chakra's ability to extract nutrients from nearly everything. Requires conditioning. Naruto glanced down at what he had written. He quickly and decidedly crossed out the words, Kyuubi's chakra. It wouldn't do for anyone in this timeline to discover that he had knowledge of Kyuubi prior to his learning of it. He wrote another note down. Mental condition. Preserved from previous timeline. Unsure of any possible side effects from time travel jutsu used by Naruto wrote Kyuubi down, but quickly crossed it out, reminding himself to not give any clues that he wasn't the same 10-year-old he had been 16 years ago. Possibility of mental deterioration or insanity is present. Must learn to control reactions to old acquaintances. Mustn't lose face as lovable idiot. Naruto noted what he had already written down. Below, he drew a straight line in a horizontal fashion, and at the end drew a much shorter vertical line crossing it. Beneath it he drew the kanji for 10. After that he wrote, arrival. Beneath that he wrote out a sequence of events. 2 years of supplementary academy education. Graduation from academy from special assignment. Assignment to Team 7 with Hitaki Kakashi as sensei. C-rank mission to Wave Country. Chunin exam participation. He continued in this fashion all the way down the lengthy scroll till he had recorded all the events of his previous timeline, just barely managing to fit eradication of Akatsuki, and use of time travel jutsu. At the very bottom margins of the scroll, Naruto sighed as set down the quill for a moment. He had to make sure no one else found this scroll. If they did, he would have no idea how to explain it to them and would have to take one of 3 courses of actions. 1. Try to make up an explanation and hope they believed it. 2. Tell them the truth. Explanation 1 was fine unless he had to retell it over and over, and then his details may become mixed up, or it may not fit with his past, and he could inadvertently lead to his own demise after being labeled a spy and killed. Option 2 would most likely result in a medal evaluation and admittance to the Konoha Psych Ward, or his execution. Or 3, he could kill the offender and bury the evidence so deep no one would ever find out exactly who did it, why it happened, or how. Naruto had taken over for Tsunade in many of the day-to-day paper filing tasks in his previous timeline. He knew just which papers to file, where to make something disappear, for good. However, Naruto didn't want anything to do with any of those outcomes. So, he had to make sure he hid this scroll very well. After his internal debate about what to do if the scroll were ever discovered, Naruto decided to take very good care of the scroll, or take one of 2 other options. He could place a minor fire seal on the scroll, so that anyone who attempted to open without first disabling the seal caused the seal to erupt into a small pile of flames, or to attach a chakra-specific or blood seal to the scroll. The blood seal ensured that anyone who wasn't of direct relation to him would never be able to open the scroll. It had to be resealed with blood every time, a pain if nothing else. The chakra-specific seal would enable that unless someone could mimic the characteristics, potency, frequency, elemental affiliation, elemental saturation, how attuned to their elemental affinity they were, they wouldn't be able to open it. It was possible, nearly impossible, but still possible, to mimic chakra to open the scroll, or with enough influx, the seal could simply be overwhelmed and the scroll could be opened. However, the seal only required a copious amount of chakra to apply and needed no reapplication after the initial sealing. Naruto decided that when he found the time, he would have to apply one. However, he needed to get back to finishing up the scroll before the next day. He moved to the right-hand side of the scroll, the left side covered in slightly sloppy, yet elegant, script. After all, a quill was different from a brush, but the basic principles of writing applied no matter what utensil you were using. At the top of the page he rewrote, "Arrival at age 10. Beneath it he listed a single item. Talk with Sandame Hokage before first attempt at Genin exam. He decided it would be incredibly important to record each event that differed from his original timeline. He didn't know what effects his actions would have on this timeline. But it was his sincere hope that at the end of the scroll, he wouldn't be writing about the eradication of Akatsuki and the end of the world. He hoped he wouldn't be writing at all. He hoped, he truly did, that some other hand would take a quill and ink, and at the bottom of the scroll put, "Death of Uzumaki Naruto due to natural causes," with an age and a date marked by it. Preferably the age would be quite an old one. Naruto sighed. He didn't have time for those thoughts at the moment. He glanced over at a small chakra-powered clock hanging on his wall. It was worn and busted in several places, and it consumed more chakra than it should have needed, but it was still fairly reliable. It was missing a second hand, and the hour hand was missing nearly half of its length, but was still fairly decipherable. The minute hand rested around where the 9 should have been placed, while the busted hour hand pointed vaguely near the 6. Almost 6 o'clock? I've got some time to burn. But what to do while I wait? Sarutobi sat behind a large mahogany wood desk. Its immaculately polished and shined surface reflected Sarutobi's face in all of its age and wear. He sighed as stared down at the reflection, willing it to just stop staring at him. He looked over at a stack of 27 immaculately written Genin exam forms. Each one was written in careful flowing calligraphy and signed with an immaculate name on the dotted line. Sarutobi slowly worked his way through the pile, stamping each one with a rubber seal showing that he approved for each student to participate in the exam. It was more of a formality than anything. As he reached the bottom of the perfectly white and stain-free papers, there was a single grubby sheet of paper at the bottom. It was wrinkled and covered in stains from what appeared to be soup broth. The handwriting wasn't exactly calligraphy, but it was fairly passable. The signature was also present. Sarutobi lifted the stamp and paused. After a moment of deliberation he let the stamp fall in an arc, imprinting a thick red inked mark in the corner. Approval for Uzumaki Naruto to participate in this year's Genin exam as a possible early graduate was approved. Now, most of the hopefully graduates were 12 years old. However, Naruto was only 10. Now, this was not due to an attempt by the teachers to put him in a class so far above his current knowledge that he wouldn't stand a snowball's chance in hell of passing. It was in fact, due to the same reason that Naruto was being given a chance to graduate early. Simply put, he was an orphan. Most children began the academy at the age of 8. For 2 years they worked on basic shinobi skills and jutsu, and history and theoretical concept. Things that wouldn't necessarily be used as a shinobi, but that could be potentially useful in an undercover mission. At the age of 10, or more specifically, at the end of the second year, the early graduate option was offered. If signed by a legal guardian, the student would be able to pass a higher-level exam to graduate early. However, in order to help prevent mental deterioration, students were mandated to be at least 10 years of age before attempting the exam. Now, if the students didn't pass the early exam, or chose not to take it, they were enrolled in a series of advanced concept classes. These classes were chosen individually by a student. They ranged from flower arranging to chakra manipulation concepts to flying knives, the art of throwing weapons to pottery, concept to shelf to clothing, merchanting and design to advanced history concepts to the most commonly taken course, shinobi preparation. These classes were designed to allow hopeful graduates to gain skill in a separate profession in the event they weren't permitted to become genin, or in case they were injured and forced to retire from shinobi duty. If a student chose to follow that path, there is a much longer path one must follow, but its details are not important at the time. Now, Uzumaki Naruto was at the age of 10, attempting to graduate with the other children of his class. He was considered an early graduate simply due to his age. He had no parents, which offered him another unique opportunity in addition to early graduation. Early enrollment. With his own approval, Naruto was enrolled in an entry-level course at the allowed maximum of 2 years. Naruto barely passed any of the classes, barely scraping along. His grades were abysmal and showed nearly no effort. However, due to the particular curriculum, a student could not be forced out of the academy due to low grades. The only things that warranted expulsion were aging beyond the academy's limits, and as a disciplinary action taken by the Hokage for certain, or repeated, offenses. Naruto, during his 4th year, took no supplementary, civilian, courses. Instead opting for the purely shinobi course. This was the sign of either an incredibly dedicated shinobi in training, or someone incredibly ignorant and thick-skulled. Naruto was considered by many to be both. In his original timeline, Naruto failed the Genin exam twice due to his original inability to perform a bunshin of any sort, but also in part due to the surreptitious efforts of his teachers to sabotage his skills. It was done partially in vengeance, but also partially in boredom. These acts ranged from switching his textbook with one missing large sections, to handing him a different test, to calling him out of class at the most inopportune moments. However, despite all of that, in his original timeline, Naruto had managed to overcome his disadvantage, with a slight nudging from Mizuki to take action, in action such as stealing the scroll of forbidden seals. However, Naruto was now a 10-year-old boy, with the mindset of a 26-year-old war-torn and hardened Uzumaki Naruto. He had already decided he wouldn't fail the Genin exam. Naruto had arrived at the conclusion that it would be best for him to pass the Genin exam as soon as possible due to several reasons. 1. He had already lived through the timeline where he began as a lovable idiot and slowly grew into a force to be reckoned with. It hadn't turned out so well. 2. This offered him more of an opportunity to change things. Being placed on a Genin team 2 years ahead of most of his original comrades would offer him a different perspective. 3. He could pass it and he didn't really feel like sitting through 2 more years of supplementary academy classes. Although he had the mindset of a 26-year-old Uzumaki Naruto, he still didn't have that long of an attention span for something so menial. With his decision made, Uzumaki Naruto stood in front of the large academy building. The windows were dark and empty, the hallways deserted, the doors locked for the night. Despite all of this, Naruto still found a sense of reverie in seeing the old building once more. After all, it had been one of the first institutions removed from shinobi lifestyle during the war. The building itself was killed in a bombing raid from the Akatsuki member Deidara during their terrorist reign over the elemental countries. Seeing the tall stone and brick building brought back many memories for the now young Uzumaki. Both good and bad. I never thought I'd see this building again. Then again, I never thought I'd see any of Konoha ever again. Naruto's words were spoken to a large and empty field. He placed his hand on the stone wall of the academy as he slowly traced old grooves and scars in the rock created by pranks or just plain weathering. But no matter how they got there, they bore meaning to Naruto. I finally get to come back and have a chance to get a real academy education, and what do I decide to do? I decide to graduate as soon as I possibly can. As Naruto slowly walked away from the academy building, if one looked closely, they would notice a single tear from the eye of Uzumaki Naruto. A loud ringing noise filled the air as Naruto groaned and rolled over in his small bed. His hand reached out from a tangled mess of bed sheets and covers to clamp down on the offending device. The clock gave a small sputtering clank as its noise died down for another day. Naruto groggily lifted himself from his bed before finally glancing at the clock. The small alarm clock had no arms and bore no numbers. In fact, it didn't even have a face. The small thing was salvaged by Naruto and he was able to set it so that it rang at approximately 5:30 every morning. It would be possible for him to reset it, but the amount of effort it took the first time, not taking into account the pliers, 2x4s, 3 screwdrivers, and 1 pair of nail clippers that had been needed to set it, it just wasn't worth it. As he slowly made his way towards his kitchenette area, he picked up a thick red marker he kept on a string hanging from his calendar. As he walked by he crossed out the day and noticed the writing. In his groggy state he had completely forgotten that today was the day his changes, hopefully, began. As he crossed out the day, the question on his mind was not the usual, what flavor of instant ramen would he be forced to have this morning, but rather, what next? Hiatsusho Mataro was an instructor at the Konoha Shinobi Academy. He was a fairly average man. He had reached the rank of Chunin after several years as a genin. He wasn't exceptionally skilled and would probably never reach the rank of Junin. He happened to, on this day, work in Academy Room number 417. Now, there was nothing wrong with Academy Room number 417. It was a fairly average classroom. It had the normal 5 rows of desks and the normal chalkboard at the front. Its desk was usually empty as teachers rotated in and out of the classroom occasionally. Konoha was fortunate to have a surplus of academy teachers. But what made this room truly special on this day was that Mataro was being given a chance to administer the genin exam. He had never been given this chance before and he was quite excited. This was a new experience for the academy teacher. What no one had told him was that the infamous prankster Uzumaki Naruto was going to be attempting the advanced test that day. If they had, then perhaps what happened to Mataro wouldn't have. Uzumaki Naruto sat in the midst of 24 screaming, chatting, yelling, overhyped, and excited 12-year-old genin hopefuls. He glanced around the room. He didn't see very many people that he recognized. He gathered that most of them either failed their genin tests, didn't participate in the Chunin exams, or they ended up looking quite different 16 years down the road when Naruto could have possibly met them. Or, maybe, they had been killed before Naruto ever had a chance to meet them. Sighing, he set his head down on his desk. He didn't know exactly what he was going to be asked to perform for this test, but he knew that it wouldn't be much of a challenge. A hush fell over the students as Mataro walked into the room smiling. He looked over the students, his eyes stopping on Uzumaki Naruto. His mind was instantly thrown into turmoil. Not because he thought of Naruto as the demon. Truth be told, very few people did. They just used it as an insult and blamed him for the death of the Yondaime, or any other variety of reasons, but because of Naruto's infamy for being a prankster. His eyes darted around the room, looking for any sort of trap or prank that could go off at any second. His mind was racing. He put something in here. I know he did. The stories about him tell that much. No teacher has ever even gone a single day without being pranked by Uzumaki Naruto. I have to be on my toes. I got to be sneaky. I can't let him know what I'm thinking. He isn't going to prank me. Mataro's enthusiasm served to help him cope with dealing with Naruto for the day. However, in the previous timeline, Naruto had indeed set up a prank for this teacher. It had resulted in his pants being glued on for about 4 days, and his hair turning hot pink for several weeks. In the original timeline, he had been thrown out for this prank. However, this time around, the teacher wouldn't step into the trap until several days later when he was cleaning up the classroom for the summer. Needless to say, at that point, there was nothing to show Naruto had set the trap. Mataro, with his renewed confidence, stepped up to the front of the classroom. "Hello kids. Today you'll all be participating in the Genin exam." A cheer went up throughout the classroom. Mataro waited for the cheer to die down. The exam will be administered in 3 separate sections. The weapons proficiency portion is first. You will be asked to show adequate skill in kunai and shuriken targeting, both stationary and moving. Second is the informational scenario test. You will be given a scenario on paper that you must describe how to handle in an acceptable and adequate fashion, meaning you must devise the best way to escape while taking minimal losses to your team and their supplies. Third, and last, is the jutsu proficiency test. You will be asked to perform the 3 jutsu taught here at the academy. Now, if you are proficient in any other weapons you may demonstrate this to me, and depending on your level of skill you may receive bonus credit for the weapons proficiency test. The same goes for the jutsu proficiency test. Now, the first portion of the test will be the informational scenario. Please prepare your brushes or quills. You will have an hour and 30 minutes to take this test. Mataro passed out 24 manila-colored sheets with a small amount of print at the top. He walked back to his desk, picked up a pink one and set it on Naruto's desk. As an early graduate you'll have to take one of the more advanced situations. Please keep in mind your paper will also be graded on a much higher scale. Mataro carefully walked away, keeping half an eye on Naruto. He didn't know when he would try anything. However, all he saw was Naruto give a small smile before picking up a brush and dipping it into the ink well on his desk. Naruto looked at the scenario before him. You and your team were participating in an undercover intelligence gathering mission deep within Iwa territory. You have just been discovered. A squad of 9 Anbu-level Iwa nins are approaching your location. Your team is comprised of 3 Junin and 2 Chunin. All of you are low on chakra, inhibiting the use of all but the most basic jutsu. You each have a supply of 5 kunai and 7 shuriken. You have 3.5 minutes to prepare for the arrival of the Iwa nins. You also have very valuable information that must be delivered to the Hokage at all costs. A recovery team is waiting several miles outside with extra supplies and support. Your objective is to deliver the information, contained in a concealed scroll, to the recovery team while suffering minimal losses. Naruto looked at the question. He pondered just exactly what a team under those conditions could do. This question was nearly impossible for a genin to complete, explaining its presence on the advanced test. Naruto quickly began brushing down his answers. Each member of the team, using what remaining chakra they can, must create as many normal bunchins as they can, while leaving enough excess chakra to perform an extended henge. Have the bunchins split up and divert across the city, attempting to draw the attention of the Iwa nins. Using an extended henge, the true shinobi must transform into common insects or animals found in the area. While under the henge, they must escape the building and head towards the recovery team. Their exceedingly low chakra levels will allow them to blend in more easily with local wildlife, preventing the Iwa shinobi from tracking their chakra signatures. With the additional time bought by the bunchin, the shinobi should have adequate time to reach the recovery team while suffering minimal losses. Naruto looked over what he had written. There were some things he had assumed, and some things that relied on luck, such as the Iwa nin being fooled by the bunchin. But overall, it seemed passable. Naruto set the brush down and stretched his arms over his head. He glanced at a clock. There were only a few minutes left in the exam. He glanced around to see that many were finished, while some were struggling to finish up their exam. He leaned back and closed his eyes and waited for the teacher to end the exam. Alright, everyone set down your brushes or quills and hand in your tests. Naruto, place your test on my desk. It must be filed separately. Once you've handed me your test, please report to the practice field for the weapons proficiency exam. The students stretched as they stood, chatting with their friends over what scenario they had been given and what they had written. Naruto set his paper on the teacher's desk and walked out the door, following the multitudes of students out to the field. Once they were all there, they waited for Motaro to arrive. He soon arrived carrying a large box of shuriken and kunai pouches. Set up at the other end of the field were targets. The two targets at the end of the field at the moment were stationary. In front of them were several long metal trays that sank into the ground. These trays were long and thin and contained moving targets for the next test. Alright students, you will each be given a pouch of kunai and shuriken. You will be asked to throw 10 kunai at one target, and 10 shuriken at another. The same test will be delivered a second time using moving targets. You must land at least 15 shuriken and kunai combined in the acceptable target range. If you wish to display proficiency in additional weapons, please approach me after the administration of this test. Motaro passed out pouches of throwing weapons to students, allowing them a minute to be accustomed to the slightly heavier real weapons. As he approached Naruto, he handed him 2 pouches and explained what his advanced test would be. You will be asked to perform the same test as the other students with slightly changed rules. You must alternate between still and moving and kunai and shuriken upon my command. You must also have 18 kunai and shuriken within a small acceptable range to pass this test. Naruto nodded and took his 2 pouches. Their weight was familiar. The training weapons usually used at the academy were lighter and blunted, being made of a weaker alloy. Naruto had grown accustomed to the real thing after years of use. He watched as the students one by one threw their weapons at the targets. Some missed a few, some made most of them. A few people didn't quite make it, but since the test only required you to score passing on 2 of the 3 sections and do decent on the third, they would still probably graduate even if they failed the thrown weapons. When it came to be Naruto's turn, he stepped up to the line and strapped the pouches on. Turning, he smirked at Motaro. "Fire away, sensei." Slightly perturbed by the blonde's confidence, Motaro began rattling off instructions. 3 kunai. Moving, still, moving. Shuriken, kunai. 2 shuriken, 3 kunai. Still, moving, moving, still. No matter how fast he spoke the instructions, Naruto's hands continued to fly in perfect form. The black and silver metal glinted in the sunlight as they streaked through the air, impacting the wooden targets. When the test was finished, Motaro was quite surprised to see 20 shuriken and kunai stuck in wooden targets, each one no more than a few centimeters from the dead center of the bull's eye. There was definitely something strange about the kid. Motaro asked if anyone wished to participate in extra credit. Naruto briefly considered it, but he doubted they would have any full-weight bakken, wooden training swords, or real katanas, or a real bastard sword similar in size to the ones wielded by Zabuza and Kisame. As such, he resisted in participating. The lighter training swords would simply throw off his balance, not to mention wielding a sword was far different from throwing weapons. Throwing weapons were easily adapted to despite height and weight changes. Naruto knew if he attempted to wield a sword without practice, he would most likely end up failing in some fashion due to his changed center of gravity. A few students tried to show off sword skills, but they were pitifully untrained in kenjutsu. He guessed that a few of them would receive a few points since they managed to show that they planned to continue in the use of swords further along in their careers. Motaro called everyone back inside to the small classroom where he explained the final jutsu test. You will all be called into the exam room. There, I will ask you to perform a passably successful kawarimi, henge, and 3 bunshin. You must be able to perform all 3, no exceptions. If you cannot perform one, you automatically fail this portion of this test. However, even if you do not perform well on one, you may perform extra credit jutsu if you wish. Now, if there are no further questions, first up, Akado Matai. Naruto sat patiently meditating while he observed all 24 students, one by one, enter the exam room, and leave with a Konoha headband newly tied on to some part of their body. At last, after minutes and minutes of waiting, Motaro called his name. Uzumaki Naruto. Naruto rose, stretched his arms, and slowly walked down the steps to the exam room. As he entered, he found Motaro standing there, a gentle smile on his face. He hadn't been pranked all day, and he believed Naruto wouldn't attempt anything right as he was about to graduate. Motaro's thoughts turned inward at that. Even if he completely and utterly fails this test, Naruto will still graduate. With how he did on the other tests, the Hokage would probably force his graduation if nothing else. Well, from what I can tell, he excelled on the written. He used knowledge most genin don't even have, and to a very effective point too. But he may decide to prank me if he knows he'll graduate. But he doesn't know about the written. I suppose I should just wait and see. Naruto watched as Motaro began to sweat slightly, his smile becoming somewhat strained. He's not going to attempt to anything, is he? Well, even if he does, I can disable him fairly quickly. I may have the body of a 10-year-old, but my skills should still be about the same. Motaro kept smiling as he finally began to speak. Alright Naruto, as I'm sure you know, you'll be taking an advanced portion of this test. This portion involves you doing 3 successive Kawarimi, a near-perfect henge, including small details, and 5 bunshin, plus an additional type of bunshin not regularly taught at the academy. You may begin when you are ready. Naruto nodded. Without even moving his hand, he disappeared, a chair appearing in his place. Next, he appeared where Motaro had previously been standing. Thirdly, he appeared standing in front of Motaro, the desk and chair on the other side of the room from where they had been previously, the same with Motaro and Naruto. The entire demonstration had only taken a fraction of a second. That was a flawless Kawarimi combo. He didn't even use seals. What is this kid? Not to mention he switched with me. Switching with living objects, of different mass and size too, is incredibly hard. This child is some sort of prodigy. Motaro looked at Naruto, who was waiting for approval to continue. Motaro gave a slight nod, to which Naruto formed the seal for henge. He disappeared. Motaro glanced around. He walked a few steps forward and found nothing. Squatting down, he looked at the floor. Where Naruto had previously stood was an insignificant minuscule dust mote. Motaro blew gently on it, and Naruto released the henge. He used seals this time, but an advanced henge? Those aren't even common amongst Junin. This kid is something else. I'm nearly afraid to see what he has for the bunshin test. Motaro nodded once more, to which Naruto nodded back. Without seals, 5 perfect bunshin appeared in front of Motaro. He nodded. Naruto formed several seals before finally speaking the name of one of his jutsu. Konoha Bunshin. Motaro blinked in surprise. He had never heard of Konoha Bunshin. In fact, Konoha was one of the only 2 grade 5 to not a bunshin technique specific to their country. However, rumor had it that several years ago Kumo had created a Rai bunshin. No confirmation had been received though. But for a boy as young as Naruto to know a bunshin like that, where had he learned it? Motaro watched as the smoke cleared, revealing 6 Narutos. In each of their mouths was a single green leaf. The one farthest to the right was first to speak. Motaro-sensei, do I pass? Motaro marked something his clipboard before smiling. With flying colors, Naruto. If I may ask, how did you create the Konoha Bunshin? I've never heard of such a thing. Motaro was quite interested in how a boy, only 10 years old no less, had created a new type of bunshin. Naruto gave a small smile. It's simple. Bunshin are simply chakra form constructs with a basic henge covering them for details. The basic bunshin is simply a chakra construct in a human shape. What makes it easier than other bunshin is that it's only chakra, there's no substance to it. With other bunshins, you have to actively use your chakra to hold the material together to form the bunshin. Once it's created, the chakra forms its own bonds and stays together. However, if one strikes a bunshin, the chakra construct is disrupted and it falls apart. Motaro nodded. He understood basic concepts behind bunshin, but he had never thought to apply it to leaves. Now, the Konoha Bunshin also have another interesting property. Motaro raised his eyebrows. He wanted to hear this. Naruto reached out a hand and punched a Konoha Bunshin in the face. However, the puff of smoke and scattering of leaves Motaro expected never came. Instead, the bunshin merely shook its head and continued to smile. Motaro was shocked. This child had created a new type of bunshin that wasn't destroyed in one hit. Forget prodigy, this kid was a legend in the making. But how? Bunshin are disrupted when you hit them. Motaro knew the kid had to have some reason behind how this worked. It's the leaves. Motaro's face merely showed puzzlement. Leaves have their own basic chakra circulatory system since they were once living. As such, the chakra doesn't need to cling to itself to hold itself together. It flows through the leaves. Of course, enough damage to a clone will disrupt it, but it can survive multiple hits. However, unlike the Kage Bunshin and other forms such as the Tsuchi and Mizu Bunshin, the Konoha Bunshin lacks attacking power. While other Bunshins are made of a solid or similar material held together by chakra, Konoha Bunshins are made of individual leaves, while other Bunshins are masses. As such, when a Konoha Bunshin attacks, it's the equivalent of a leaf hitting you in a breeze. Because Konoha Bunshin are simply that, leaves. Mataro nodded dumbly. This boy understood concept, creation, utilization, and weaknesses of his own jutsu, which, believe it or not, many ninja overlooked, and he knew about Kage Bunshin. This boy was truly a genin in a class of his own. Well, Naruto, I think it's safe to say you pass with flying colors. Needless to say, your Konoha Bunshin technique will be put on record with you as its originator. Also, I'm putting in a recommendation to the Hokage. I believe you need to join a genin team in their second or third year in the field. Your abilities surpass that of a normal genin. Now, here's your headband, you're dismissed for the day. Please report back here tomorrow for your team assignment. Naruto bowed and accepted the headband. Tying it around his neck, he thanked Mataro and exited the exam room. A loud yippee could be heard not long after. Despite being mentally 26 years old, Naruto still couldn't help but be happy at becoming a ninja. It was a marked change from his last life, one that would hold many surprises for him in the future. The Hokage's office, 1 hour later, 1800. Mataro entered the lobby of the top floor of the Hokage Tower. Bowing to the receptionist, he spoke in a respectful tone. "Miki-san, would you please inform the Hokage that I have arrived with the results of this year's genin exam and wish to discuss the results and team placements with him?" The green-eyed woman behind the desk gave Mataro a small smile while brushing a strand of brown hair out of her eyes. "Of course, Mataro-san, the Hokage has been expecting you. I will notify him that you are here." Miki stood up and walked to the wooden wall behind her. Sliding open a panel, a small circular seal was revealed. Channeling a small amount of chakra into it, Miki spoke into it. "Hokage-sama, Mataro-san is here with the results of the genin exam and wishes to speak with you." She paused for a moment before sliding the panel closed. "The Hokage will see you now, Mataro-san. Please, go in." Mataro nodded to Miki and opened the door to the Hokage's office. Stepping inside, he approached the Hokage's desk. The Hokage had already cleared his desk in anticipation of his arrival. Mataro bowed to the Hokage. "It is an honor to have the privilege of organizing team placements with you, Hokage-sama." The Hokage just waved his hand in a nonchalant manner. "Have a seat, Mataro-kun. And please, call me Sarutobi." Mataro nodded and pulled up a chair to the other side of the Hokage's desk. "Now, what do we have to work with this year?" Mataro nodded and set out 9 stacks of folders, 3 manila folders in each one. Except for the last one. The last stack was a single pink-colored folder. "I believe these would be the best the team placements, Sarutobi-sama. I have organized the students into balanced groups based on their abilities, scores, class rankings, and future prospects." Sarutobi nodded. It didn't seem fair, but it was sometimes necessary to place 3 students who were likely to continue as shinobi together, and group 3 who weren't likely to make it. As much as it was looked down upon, it helped team unity and morale among better prospects. Sarutobi looked over the groups, leaving the pink folder alone. He occasionally moved one folder from one stack to another, switching a few around. Overall, very few changes were made. "Well, Mataro-kun, what do you think of these placements? I believe that with a little added direction these groups may work out in a better fashion." Mataro looked over the groups, nodding at each one. "You are correct, Sarutobi-sama. These would work well, but why the extra focus on generalization over specialization?" Sarutobi took out his pipe, lighting it with a small flick of fire chakra from his finger. Taking a deep breath, he slowly exhaled, creating small smoke rings. "I chose to focus them more on generalization since Konoha is lacking in many skills. Weapons and taijutsu masters are severely lacking at the current time. With generalization, we offer genin more of a chance to choose what they wish to pursue, rather than what they're directed towards." Mataro nodded. Without impending war, it wasn't necessary to force specialization. He gave another nod, with an appreciative noise. He took several rubber bands, bundling each genin team together. "I suppose the chosen sensei are acceptable even with the changed groups?" Sarutobi took a drag on his pipe. Yes, although some sensei would be better suited to specific students, we cannot afford that many apprenticeships and we cannot risk one team unable to progress because of a sensei not suited to their needs. Now, is that all, Mataro-kun? Mataro's hand hovered over the last folder. The pink one. No, Sarutobi-sama, Mataro said with a sigh. The Hokage merely raised his eyebrows, still smoking, at that. He hadn't expected anything else. And what else is there for us to discuss, Mataro-kun? The Hokage's face was light and jovial, the face of a friend. It is concerning Uzumaki Naruto's early examination. The Hokage's face suddenly became stern and serious. He had far too much experience dealing with those attempting to sabotage Naruto. He didn't take lightly to matters concerning him. Yes, what about his exam? The Hokage left the statement hanging. It sounded more like a threat than a question. I do not believe that Uzumaki Naruto should be placed on a New Year Genin team. He doesn't have the skills for it. This caused the Hokage's eyes to gain a dangerous glint. Why is this, Mataro-kun? It wouldn't be due to his tenant, would it? I also hope you're not trying to undermine Naruto's efforts by understating his skills either. The Hokage's statement was a dangerous one, promising pain if Mataro was attempting anything along those lines. No, Sarutobi-sama. I believe he should be placed in a third-year Genin team or a 2-year team at least. His skills are far above a Genin's. I would suggest putting him in the Chunin exam as a serious competitor if he wasn't so young. This caused the Hokage's eyes to widen. This man, he realized, did actually see Naruto as Naruto. And why is that, Mataro-kun? The Hokage's tone no longer held any venom. It was instead a more caressing and questioning melody. Mataro picked up the pink folder and handed it to the Hokage. If you would review his file, I believe you will see why I recommend this placement. The Hokage accepted the folder and began to read over his performance. He was first astonished by the written portion. Chakra sensing isn't discussed in the academy. That's training begun at Chunin. How would Naruto know about that? There's no way he could have eavesdropped on those conversations, they're held privately with teams. I'll have to speak with him about it. Sarutobi continued on, his pipe nearly falling out of his mouth at the sight of Naruto's weapons scores. A Genin, no, an academy student scoring a 20/20 on that test is unheard of. Most Genin failed the early test because of that. Even some Chunin have trouble scoring perfectly. And he was so close to the bull's eye too. Sarutobi's surprise at the first 2 tests was nothing when he read about the jutsu test. This time, his pipe really did fall out of his mouth. He created his own jutsu? At 10? Not only that, but he can effectively explain the Bunshin chakra construct? It seems I have greatly underestimated you, Naruto. Perhaps I should have a talk with you. Clearing his throat and picking up the fallen pipe, the aged Hokage spoke slowly, carefully, and with remorse. Unfortunately, no Genin teams are lacking a member at this time. Perhaps after the Chunin exam. Mataro's face became downcast. But he's such a promising student, Sarutobi-sama. Couldn't we put him on 4th member rotation till a spot becomes available? A talent like this shouldn't be wasted. Not on waiting 4 months for the Chunin exams. Sarutobi sighed. I agree. But I don't think 4th member rotation would give a mind like this the attention it deserves to grow. But, perhaps I have another solution. Reaching under his desk, Sarutobi focused chakra into one of many seals on the underside of his desk. This one was marked with the kanji for retrieval. Nearly instantly 4 men, or women, their gender was undeterminable, appeared before the desk wearing animal masks and long black cloaks. You called for us, Hokage-sama? A low rumbling, slightly mechanical voice emanated from the mask. It was then that Mataro realized who these people were. They were the Anbu, the elite assassination force of Konoha. The voice changers implanted in the masks to hide their identities were somewhat of a giveaway. The Hokage nodded towards the figures. Raven, Rabbit, Rat, and Robin. I wish for you to retrieve Hitaki Kakashi for me. Now, the figures nodded. The Anbu lived to serve and protect. To retrieve, Raven spoke. The Anbu lived to serve and protect. To return, Rabbit spoke. The Anbu lived to serve and protect. To rescue, Rat spoke. The Anbu lived to serve and protect. To repay, Robin spoke last. In a singular mechanical rumble they spoke at once. The Anbu lived to serve and protect. Retrieval Anbu, disperse. At once they all disappeared from the room in a shimmer of black cloaks. Sarutobi just sighed. Sarutobi-sama, are they always so eccentric? Yes, Mataro-san, they are. Although their names all begin with R, and they are all retrieval Anbu, they are some of my most highly dedicated and skilled Anbu. I just sometimes wish they were more normal. And then I think of what life would be like if they were. And I let things be. Mataro gave a small chuckle. As he laughed, a thud was heard behind him. Turning in his seat, he saw the body of one of Konoha's most skilled shinobi, the copycat shinobi, Hitaki Kakashi, lying on the floor in a heap. Standing over him were Raven, Rabbit, Rat, and Robin. Mission completed, Hokage-sama. Permission for open-faced leave? Sarutobi nodded at Raven's request. The Anbu reached up, removing their masks, revealing feminine faces. Kakashi groaned. You asked for me, Hokage-sama? Sarutobi nodded, a smile spreading across his face. Yes, I did, Kakashi. What made you so sure? He looked up with his one eye, giving that familiar eye smile. You only send the Rs if you're looking for me. Sarutobi chuckled before motioning with his hand. The Anbu nodded before disappearing once more. Now, what do you need, Hokage-sama? Sarutobi took a large puff of smoke before speaking. I believe you may be able to aid us on this subject we were currently discussing. What do you know of shinobi apprenticeships? Naruto's apartment, after the Genin exam 1745. The door to Naruto's apartment opened with a soft click as he entered the small area. He flipped a switch next to the door, causing a pale yellow light emanating from the small bulb to fill the room. Smiling, he slowly made his way to the writing desk in his room. Reaching down, he tapped the front of a drawer 4 times. He opened it slowly and carefully. He reached over to the side and tapping a side, it fell off, revealing a small new side. A seal was drawn on it. Focusing chakra to the seal, a scroll appeared in Naruto's hands. Storage seals were exceedingly simple, and having practiced them for upwards of 12 years, writing one on the inside of his desk was of no consequence or trial to Naruto. Unraveling the scroll, he placed it on the desk. Reaching over, he picked up a quill. He unstopped the ink well and dipped the quill in once more. He moved down the scroll a ways, before stopping next to a note. Age 10. Failed Genin exam. On the column next to it, he added, passed Genin exam. He looked over the events of his previous life. There weren't very many important ones early on. He realized that it would many more age annotations this time around. Giving a smile at how much better he believed this time around was going to be. Naruto stopped the ink bottle once more, and set the quill aside. After storing the scroll back in its seal, Naruto laid on the couch, absently running his finger across the headband. He noted how all the nicks and notches he remembered from his old one were missing. It was similar to his life, he thought. In his previous life, he was fulfilling expectations. He was living up to what he expected to be. In this life, he was starting anew. A fresh start. A new headband. Hitaki Kakashi was a shinobi of renown. He was known throughout the 5 great villages as Sharingan Kakashi, the copycat ninja, Kakashi of the Sharingan Eye, the false Uchiha, and many more names. He was known for having copied almost every single jutsu he had ever seen. His implanted Sharingan Eye, gained from a fallen comrade in a failed mission in Iwa years ago, allowed him to collect information on any jutsu he saw. He used this to great effect, turning shinobi's own jutsu against them in a battle. However, besides its obviously powerful effects of copying jutsu and other techniques, the biggest advantage given by a Sharingan Eye was the psychological advantage it offered. He had worked as an Anbu captain for years, often administering tests to prospective Genin teams, saying that if they passed he would work as a Junin sensei. However, with his recent step down, a nice way of saying he wasn't fit for Anbu duty anymore, he had inadvertently opened himself up for an apprenticeship. Something he never really wanted a part of. Apprenticeships worked much in the same way that Genin teams did, excepting the fact that an apprenticeship was one person along with their teacher, rather than a team. It was more common among specialists than generalists like Kakashi. Many expected Yuhi Kurenai to later become a genjutsu specialist and to apprentice certain students to her art. Another aspect was that many apprentices were chunin or newly ranked junin. Genin often didn't have enough experience or developmental growth to be considered for an apprenticeship. Hitaki Kakashi, despite his legendary talents and many accomplishments, had ended up with the newly promoted genin, Uzumaki Naruto, as an apprentice. Many would wonder simply why Naruto was apprenticed to Kakashi of all people. In time, the denizens of Konoha would most likely come to resent the bond and instead favor placing Uchiha Sasuke as Kakashi's apprentice, as they both had the Sharingan. But the reason behind the placement was political persuasion and specialization. Sasuke was a combat assault specialist in the making. With his ability to predict movement, once he awakened his Sharingan and his fire jutsu arsenal, he would be an excellent choice to place on the front lines in a war. On the other hand, Naruto's devious mind and preference for high-powered techniques made him perfect for an assassination specialist. Many people believed Kakashi to be a generalist, but his only original jutsu, Chidori and Reikiri, were used for assassination purposes. Even his summons, the Nin dogs, were used for assassination purposes. As such, Sarutobi had felt it would be best, given Naruto's exceptional scores on the test, to place him with Kakashi to be trained as an assassin. This is how Kakashi came to be standing in front of the academy building. He hadn't been here since he was about 6 years old. It reminded him too much of his quick ascent through the ranks. Of the war he was forced to endure because of his quick ascent. The war that sent him on a near-suicidal mission into the heart of Iwa. The mission into the heart of Iwa that took one of his teammates from him and drove the other one into the thralls of a hermit. The teammate that gave him his Sharingan eye reminded him of the Iwa shinobi who attacked them. The Iwa shinobi who were comrades of the Iwa shinobi who drove his father to suicide. It was true that the academy building drove Kakashi's thoughts down a dark and ravaging pathway. However, he hoped that this time, a new set of memories would extend from the building. Ones along the lines of him experiencing good times with his apprentice. However, to Kakashi, that outcome wasn't very likely. Instead, his mind was filled with past memories of squads being driven into the mud and dirt, their faces streaked by tears and blood. Their minds filled with turmoil and depression as the Hitaki denounced them as ninja and rejected them from the program. In fact, one of those students had gone on to form a very successful restaurant business. Kakashi often visited the restaurant to speak with a former student and to laugh for a few minutes. Another former student had gone on to be a traveling merchant. He had laughed in the face of danger, which caused him to fail as a ninja. On a trip through the dangerous grass country, he refused to hire a guide and ended up dying from ingesting several poisonous plants. In this collage of memories, Kakashi couldn't remember a single team or student who had been up to his standards, and this saddened him. Because for all his showing off and for all his attitude and nonchalance, inside, Kakashi was a wreck. He was alone in the world. And even with his little orange books to shore up his emotional wreckage, he still had an empty hole in his heart. Kakashi stepped up to the door of the academy and glanced at the sun in the sky. He was, in fact, early. Thinking quickly of the memorial stone with Obito's name on it, Kakashi turned to leave. It was his duty to pay homage to his fallen comrades. However, at that moment, a moment from his past flashed through his mind. It was one he had all but forgotten through the years. Flashback. A young Kakashi sat on a stump next to his two teammates, Inuzuka Rin and Uchiha Obito. A tall blonde figure known as Namikaze Minato, the future fourth Hokage, stood grinning in front of them. Behind him was a large obsidian stone. Its face was covered in hundreds of tiny names, carved with the exact precision of the Aburame carvers. Minato had called the team's meeting at that particular location for a reason. He had decided it was time that they all got a lesson in humility. Alright, do any of you guys know what this is behind me? Rin and Obito's faces were clueless. Only Kakashi seemed to know what it was. It's the memorial stone, Minato-sensei. Minato smiled and nodded at Kakashi's declaration. He turned his back to them and looked at the large stone. The names of all of Konoha's greatest heroes are carved into this stone. This shinobi are held in the same prestige as every single legendary shinobi Konoha has ever produced. Their esteem is perhaps second only to that of the Hokage. At this, Obito began to grin. My name will be on that stone one day. I'll be remembered as one of Konoha's heroes. Minato didn't even turn at his student's declaration. They are remembered this way for being KIA. Do you know what that means, Obito? Obito shook his head. He didn't have any idea of what it meant. Without turning, Minato spoke again. It means killed in action. Every single name on here is one of a shinobi who was killed in service of Konoha. Rin and Obito's faces were shocked. Kakashi's however stood still and unmoving as ever. "Take back what you said now, Obito." Kakashi's voice, although seemingly emotionless, held the barest hints of a mocking tone. At this, Obito's face became stern. No, even Minato seemed surprised at Obito's declaration. Taking it back would dishonor those who have died. Dying in combat is an honorable death for a shinobi. I'd rather die fighting than lying in a bed old and helpless. If my name ever graces that stone, then I want it to serve to show people that Konoha shinobi aren't cowards. And I'd want them to remember that I sacrificed what I had to for the village, not that I was dead. Minato smiled at what Obito said. "That's quite a declaration for you, Obito, and I'm proud of it. You have the true heart of a Konoha shinobi." Obito grinned as Minato ruffled his hair. Kakashi huffed and turned away. None of them knew that less than half a year later Obito would be lying, barely alive, underneath a rock, and that his name would end up on the stone like he said it would. No one knew that years later, Minato's name would join his on the stone after the sealing of Kyuubi. Because at that moment, they had truly been a team. End flashback. Kakashi's hand rested on the doorknob to the academy. He hadn't realized he'd been walking closer to the door in his reverie. As he envisioned two teens come jumping off the steps, large grins on their faces, a much younger boy behind them scoffing at their actions, a tall blonde figure laughing at their antics trailing behind them. He shook his head. Have I been wrong this whole time? Was I doing what I should have been? I'm sorry, Obito, I failed you. But I promise, I'll find some way to make it up to you. Kakashi opened the door and walked in, heading for Academy Room 417. He had a promise to keep. Even if he couldn't keep it now, he would when given the chance. 15 minutes earlier, Academy Room 417. The class of genin laughed and yelled as they awaited their team placements. Naruto sat by himself in the front row, the singular, unmoving and much more diminutive figure amongst the crowd. The teacher, Motaro, stood, proud and cheerful in front of all of them. He held in his hand a single sheet of paper, names of 25 students and 9 teachers printed in neat, military font on it. He began to speak to the class before reading the names. "Welcome to your last few minutes at the academy. I know you've all trained hard for this moment and have been waiting years for this chance. I'm proud to stand here today, to watch you as you leave for the life of a shinobi. Your Hokage and your village thank you for your sacrifice. We know that many of you have left behind family traditions and businesses to come here, and we thank the shinobi of Konoha for that. If it was not for you, this new generation, then Konoha would be left standing defenseless in its time of dire need. So please, go with pride, and go without fear. Before you lays a great open world, and it is the fruit that is ripe for the picking." With a gentle smile and those kind words, Motaro delivered upon those Junin the adolescents of the age. With the team assignments, Motaro had forged friendships and romances, and broken hearts and forced tears to be shed. He had given the Junin what every commander aspires for, soldiers whose minds are filled with the thoughts of glory, of hope, of heroism, of life. What he had not done, was given them what every commander needs. Soldiers who are versed in blood and death. Soldiers who can cut a swath through enemy lines, the glistening blood raining down on their bodies, the faces of abject terror staring back at them, eyes slowly glazing over in a blank film, their blood slowly cooling into a miasma of flesh and death. All the while, their eyes kept straight forward, never blinking, their minds untouched by the multitude of death that threatened to engulf them. No, Motaro had unwittingly driven 7 of those genin to their deaths. Their first C-rank missions, they rushed headlong into the fray, hopes of glory filling their wits, leaving no room for sense. They were cut down in a glint of steel without a second thought. And of the remaining 18 genin, he had driven 3 to suicide. Unable to bear the horrors of true war, they committed suicide on the field, their friends and commanders bearing the grim visages of forced acceptance. And of those remaining 15 genin, he drove 2 of them, Kunoichi, to a fate worse than death. Their minds, and their bodies, were tortured, raped, carnal pleasures to beasts most would not bestow the title of man upon. They would be ravaged in such a manner for hours without end, until their teammates finally reached them amidst the blood and gore. And in the rage, those beasts would be cut down like pigs in a slaughterhouse, their unworthy blood splattering the floundering Kunoichi. And in their grief, the teammates would fail to notice that although their tears absolved the bodies of the victims of the horrible torturous things they were put through, Their spirits had already departed, destined for something far beyond what the living comprehend, the scars of their lives borne upon their broken bodies. And of the 11 remaining genin, one would simply falter after the death of one of his teammates while attempting to rescue the third from the vile creatures that tortured her even as she cried out for terrible mercy. And of the remaining 10, 9 would go on to become successful shinobi. The 10th was Uzumaki Naruto. One who would go on to live in legend, or so he wished. Naruto watched as the new genin left with their sensei. He knew in his heart, many of them he would never see again. And as they slowly drifted away, eventually it was just him and Motaro left in the room. Naruto expected Kakashi would be in soon. He could sense him outside. Motaro sighed and sat down at his desk. Naruto just patiently waited. About half an hour later the door opened and Hitaki Kakashi poked his head in, his single visible eye crinkled upwards in an expression of joy. "Uzumaki Naruto?" he asked, looking in the direction of the only student in the room. Naruto nodded slightly at Kakashi's question. "Good. Now then, I would like you to meet me tomorrow at 0600 hours sharp at Training Grounds 9. And don't be late." With that jovial jaunt of cheer and spring, Kakashi closed the door, giving a nod and a wave to Motaro. Naruto just sighed and stood up stretching. He grinned with relief at the popping of his joints. He had till tomorrow to prepare for whatever it was Kakashi had planned. Perhaps this time, he would receive better training without the Uchiha there to interfere. However, a frown crossed Naruto's face. Kakashi was not restricted to training just him. In his time off he could be training the Uchiha if he wished. He sighed. There wasn't much he could do about it. Kakashi still knew him as an idiot here. Perhaps it was time that the Naruto that they perceived finally began to mature. Giving Motaro a friendly wave, Naruto walked out the door of the nearly empty classroom, leaving Motaro all to himself in the now student-less academy. As he walked out the doors, a wind whispered through the academy. Carried on, it was the laughter of a class of 26 academy students, each one only 10 years old. As the wind passed by Naruto, he felt the slight warmth it held. Taking a deep breath, he kept walking. "I'll be there for you guys this time. It won't happen again." As Naruto spoke of his conviction, an image passed through his mind unwillingly. Its grotesque shape, form and bloodied surroundings bringing shivers to his form. The image was one of his friends lying in heaps of organs and bloodied flesh, the red ooze still seeping from their cooling bodies. And standing over their massacred bodies was the image of one man Naruto swore to kill. As the figure stood over the corpses, he began to laugh. A cold, chilling laugh that cut to the bone. As he laughed, his spinning red eyes bore into Naruto's own bloodied irises. Naruto's breath was coming in short gasps as he relived that moment. Flashbacks were dangerous to a ninja, and this one was no different. Steeling himself, Naruto kept going, heading for a training ground where he hoped to find a certain man. His body's strength and muscle tone was pitiful, and he felt it was time he began correcting the mistakes of his past life. Nodding his head at his unspoken declaration, Naruto broke into a light jog as he headed towards Training Ground 4. The future training ground of Team 18, better known as Team Guy. Hitaki Kakashi stood outside two large oaken doors. Inside of the doors was the office of one Sarutobi Sasuke, the third Hokage of Konoha. Kakashi needed to talk with somebody, and he felt the Sandaime was the one who would fill that role the best. One of the guards standing next to the door, without turning, spoke to Kakashi. "The Hokage will now grant an audience to you, Hitaki-san. Please enter." Standing, he nodded. Opening the doors, he slowly entered. Behind a large desk sat the old Hokage. He looked up as Kakashi entered, small wisps of smoke rising from his pipe. "Ah, Kakashi, what brings you here today?" A rare smile graced his face as he stood, stacks of pipers slightly obscuring his form. Kakashi walked over smiling, and bowed to the Hokage. "Hokage-sama, I wish to speak to you about matters concerning my new..." He paused for a moment, seemingly at a loss for words. Quote ellipsis. "Apprentice." The Sandaime nodded. He had expected this. He walked towards the door, motioning for Kakashi to follow him. "Come, Kakashi. I believe you and I have much to discuss, and this empty office is not the best place to speak of such matters." As he spoke, he left the office, Kakashi following after him. In a small dark room, beneath a maze of tunnels and dark things, a man with a single eye, and a single arm, swore as the seal inscribed on his wall dulled in color, returning to black from his previous bright red. In addition, a minuscule seal, inscribed near invisibly on the inside of the Hokage's desk also dimmed in color, the sound in the underground room, still echoing with the words of the Hokage. The Hokage slowly breathed in the tobacco-laced smoke, allowing it to fill his lungs with its pleasant addicting taste, letting it permeate his body. Letting out the smoke-laced breath, he turned his head towards Kakashi as they walked down the village streets. "Now Kakashi, what questions concerning Naruto do you have?" Kakashi looked at the Hokage for a moment before speaking. "Why me, sir? Why was I chosen to be the Uzumaki's master? Wouldn't someone like Anko be a better choice? She's more of an assassination battle-cross than I am." At this the Hokage held up his hand. "You misunderstand his position, Kakashi. Naruto is not going into form of generalization at this time. He is training to be a full-time assassin. Later, I will consider him for a frontline fighter, but for now, he will be trained as an assassin, under your tutelage." Kakashi nodded, his face still holding traces of doubt. Why make him an assassin though? He doesn't seem to be one for the quiet and discretion assassination requires. He has an incredibly large chakra capacity too, which also makes for a frontline fighter. The Hokage nodded. He had encountered this resistance before. His chakra capacity is one of the reasons he is perfect for assassination. Many assassination jutsu require a large chakra capacity as they are intended for an instant kill. Then, if the assassins are caught, they are nearly defenseless as most assassins lack chakra capacity. Naruto on the other hand has an unnaturally large amount of chakra. Besides, have you seen the boy's henge? The henge was a fairly basic ninja technique, alongside the Kawarimi and Bunshin jutsu, was taught at the academy. The henge worked by expelling a visible wall of chakra. This chakra was molded to shapes and colors and projected an image. Most henges were of someone the same size, or of a larger size than the user of the jutsu. An advanced henge involved transforming into something small than yourself. This was because you had to create a bubble of chakra that deflected light around yourself, causing you to disappear, while still allowing a small portion to reflect the image you wished to create. Kakashi shook his head. He didn't see how a henge could be anything special. "No sir, I haven't. I understand that it can be held for a long period of time?" The Hokage just smiled knowingly. "Not exactly, Kakashi. His henge actually forms a solid being." The Hokage's words were spoke like they were typical everyday conversation. Now, many people would wonder exactly why a solid henge was such a big accomplishment. After all, ninja could make solid clones of themselves. Why was a solid henge such a strange thing? The thing about clones was they were an exact copy formed out of solid or near solid chakra construction. They were often formed by the use of a medium as a chakra conductor, such as water, earth, leaves, or like the fabled Inazuma, lightning, Bunshin, electricity. A henge seemed to be basically the same principle, only with focusing the chakra in a new form. This is exactly what made solid henges nearly impossible. Normal henges consisted of the chakra pushed outwards, or simply flowing around a person. But a solid henge required that the chakra form itself into a solid form of just a mental image. The chakra actually had to become real flesh and blood. A solid henge, if cut, would bleed. However, forcing chakra outside of your body, while drawing in enough natural chakra to cause it to become a real being, was something special. Kakashi's eye widened at the mention of that. A solid henge was not unheard of, but it was considered nearly impossible to learn, even harder to perform, and beyond impossible to recreate after the first shinobi, one of the 12 chakra sages, whoever created it. And here, a boy only 10 years old, had recreated a technique created by one of the 12 founding shinobi. You're serious?" The Hokage nodded. Kakashi just shook his head and started counting the gods he had to thank for giving him such an incredibly promising student. "Now Kakashi, before I actually let you go to teach the boy, seeing as how you're very excited by that prospect, I would like to discuss your use of Chidori and Reikiri as assassination techniques, and your possible thoughts of teaching them to Naruto." Kakashi nodded as the Hokage began to speak. In the shadows of a nearby food stall, a man quietly enjoying his onigiri was taking notice of every word that he could. However, he heard no mention of the Kyuubi, and he couldn't quite catch the name as it was spoken in hushed tones. However, the mention of an incredibly powerful technique recreated by a young boy was an interesting prospect. He finished his onigiri and green tea before politely excusing himself. As he left the stall, a slight wind ruffled his sleeve, allowing one to catch the barest glimpse of a large tree tattooed on his left bicep, its roots extending along his muscles. Maeda Guy was renowned far and wide as a true master of taijutsu. Although he could use chakra, he rarely utilized it, instead favoring to use hand-to-hand techniques. His body was toned to a point of near perfection. It was said his strength could almost rival Tsunade's monstrous strength. If Guy's control were placed on the same level, his punches would be the most devastating in the world. However, years of strict physical training had diminished Guy's chakra control, and as he had begun focusing on physical strength at a rather young age, he had neglected to grow his chakra capacity during the years in which he would have the highest level of growth. Although he utilized very few chakra techniques, that was not to mean Guy was not proficient in the ones he did use. On the contrary, Guy had the few techniques that he did use down to a near art form. It was said, even with his minuscule, in comparison, chakra capacity, Guy could summon the boss of any summon contract with chakra left to spare. This was not simply due to control. Guy had altered the technique in such a way that enabled him to perform such amazing feats. No one quite understood how Guy did it, but then again, no one understood the summoning technique either. No one understood Guy for that matter either. Guy was also one of the Junin who were lucky enough to have taken genin teams under their wings. Guy's teams was Team 18. It consisted of Rock Lee, Higurashi Tenten, and Hyuga Neji. Rock Lee was nearly a carbon copy of Guy. He wore the same green spandex training suit, and had the same black, bowl-cut hair, and the same disturbingly sized eyebrows. He was unable to use chakra due to a defect in his chakra system. The defect caused his system to systematically eradicate any of the small amounts of excess chakra that he produced. This led Lee to become a taijutsu specialist, much like his sensei. Higurashi Tenten was the second student of Maeda Guy. Tenten helped in running the Higurashi Weapons store, located in the market district. The main head of the store was her father, a retired Tokubetsu Junin, Higurashi Muti. Tenten specialized in the use of weaponry, both long and short range. She was also one of the few shinobi who could use some of the more exotic and foreign weapons to at least a small degree of proficiency. These ranged from sickles to knives, to scythes, to maces, to ball and chains, to clubs, to many other manners of weapons. However, Tenten's weapons proficiency had cost her in her other skills. She knew very few ninjutsu, and knew almost no genjutsu. Her taijutsu was very weak, relying almost solely on weaponry. However, the techniques that Tenten did know were used to devastating effect. She had also mastered, to a small degree, a few fuinjutsu, mainly the storage and transportation seals. The last student of Maeda Guy was Hyuga Neji. Neji was the son of Hisashi, the twin brother of Hiyashi, the head of the Hyuga clan. Neji was a member of the branch house of the Hyuga clan. As his father's life was sacrificed under extenuating circumstances that Neji was not privy to, he had come to blame his misfortune on the main house, and his cousin, Hinata. Neji was a genius of the Hyuga style, the Jukin. Although he had great skill concerning his taijutsu, and his bloodline, the Byakugan, he was hardly proficient in any ninjutsu, or genjutsu. Maeda Guy was chosen as their sensei as he could draw out Tenten's and Neji's taijutsu abilities, while aiding Lee. However, they were neglected in other fields. Guy had been thinking of ways to help them overcome this disadvantage. The only solution he could think of was to ask his eternal rival, Hitaki Kakashi, for assistance regarding jutsu training. However, Guy's pride and flames of youth would not allow him to do such a thing. Guy had been sitting on a tree stump pondering this question while his students sparred in another area of the training ground. It was this sight that Naruto encountered as he approached Guy's team. Guy sitting on a stump, while his students sparred. Naruto did a double take as he noticed Guy's team sparring. They shouldn't have graduated from the academy for another year. He walked up to Guy, his students still in his mind, and stood in front of him, waiting for Guy to notice him. However, after a few moments, it appeared that Guy was going to do no such thing as he was absorbed too deeply in his own thoughts. Naruto broke the silence with a simple request. "Excuse me, Maeda-san, But may I have a moment of your time? No sooner had Naruto finished his question, than Guy looked up, a spark in his eye. Without even glancing towards Naruto, he flung his arms skyward, catching Naruto under the jaw with a fist, sending him spiraling. Yosh, I have it. I will ask the Hokage to teach my students ninjutsu. Although Sandaime-sama is not as young as he once was, his flames of youth still burn brightly. Suddenly realizing something, he drooped. But the Sandaime is a very busy man. He will not have the time. Oh well, back to the drawing board. During his outburst, Guy had caught the attention of his students, but that was soon distracted by the small child sailing through the air. Lee had been in the process of initiating a Konoha Senpu aimed towards Neji at the time. However, Guy's outburst caused him to change his course, and he had already committed to completing the move. As such, he couldn't stop it. His distraction caused his kick to instead collide with the head of Uzumaki Naruto. Naruto's vision began to fade away. The last thing he saw was the image of Lee and Tenten running towards him. The last words he heard were, "Oh no. Guy-sensei, forgive me. In my unyouthfulness I have killed a young child." Lee burst in great heaving sobs as he kneeled by Naruto's body. Naruto had one last thought before he passed out. Maybe this wasn't such a great idea after all. A dark empty stone cavern stood nearly empty. A large seal on the wall glowed brightly as voices drifted throughout the cavern. A man sat behind a large desk, listening to the voices. The man has a bandage that encircled his head, covering his right eye. He was also missing his right arm, and carried a cane. Dark greasy hair drifted lazily in front of his face, his single visible eye seemingly drooping along with the rest of his pale and waxy skin. On the desk was the image of a large tree, its roots extending along its lengths and down the sides. The man's name was Danzo. Danzo was a member of Konoha's Shinobi Council. He was the antithesis to the third Hokage. He wished for war and chaos and blood and death, whereas the third Hokage preferred to vie for peace and prosperity. Danzo had also headed the Konoha Black Ops division known as Root. Root had been officially disbanded after the Second Great War under the rule of the Nidaime Hokage. Root's original purpose had been deep infiltration and suicide missions. Because of the emotional training they received, Root operatives would never crack under torture or lose sight of their objective. Their participation in the Second Great War turned the tides for Konoha. However, the Nidaime had seen the methods as inhumane and disbanded the group. Danzo, however, had other ideas. Root had simply gone underground, quite literally, and continued to operate, their allegiance now being owed to Danzo rather than to the Hokage. Danzo had long opposed the Sandaime, and sought to seize power for himself. His espionage tactics were underhanded and ruthless. He kept himself well informed. On the inside of Sarutobi's desk, a minuscule seal had been carved. This was a sound transfer seal. It took in any sound from the Hokage's office, and played it back through the much larger seal in Danzo's office. The larger seal acted as an amplifier, allowing the barely heard sounds to be fully comprehended. As Danzo listened to the usual mission reports, the door to his office opened. Barely even turning his head to regard the man standing in the doorway, he spoke. "What do you have to report?" His voice was low and meaningful. No syllable was wasted. It was also greasy and snake-like, slipping and spilling from his mouth, like a dribble of vomit and drool. Despite his mannerisms of speaking, he managed to instill fear, as his words caressed you, lulled you into security, promised you sugars and sweets, and a nice place to sleep, before its fangs sunk into your neck. The man made no movement even after being on the receiving end of Danzo's greased words. "I was positioned at a small onigiri stand, just as you ordered, Danzo-sama. As I ate, the Sandaime passed by along with Hitaki Kakashi." Danzo nodded. Sarutobi speaking to a shinobi wasn't uncommon, but outside his office it was. He mentioned an apprentice of Kakashi's, and his techniques, the Reikiri and the Chidori. He mentioned assassination and a name. "I apologize, but I was unable to hear the name that he used." Danzo nodded. He waved his single arm, dismissing the ninja who turned and left, the image of a tree visible on his left arm. Danzo leaned back in his chair, speaking lowly to himself. Kakashi taking an apprentice? That is, an unexpected turn of events. However, this shouldn't be too much of an issue. As long as, before the name was spoken, Danzo noticed the man from before standing once more in the doorway, bowing. What is it this time? Danzo was becoming slightly annoyed at this constant interruption. I apologize, Danzo-sama, but I neglected to mention an important piece of information. The boy, who will become Kakashi's apprentice, was mentioned having used a henge. Danzo just gave a disinterested stare. Why should I care? Any student strong enough to become an apprentice is able to perform a henge. The man stayed bowing. I apologize for not being more specific. He used a solid henge. A technique, from what I heard, has not been seen since the days of the 12 chakra sages. At that, Danzo's eye widened. His previous thoughts of killing the forgetful operative had fled his mind. Are you sure that they said it was a technique from the 12 chakra sages? The man nodded. Danzo waved his arm, dismissing the man, talking to himself. The 12 chakra sages, masters of mind and body and teachers of the 6 paths sage. For one to recreate one of their techniques, they would have to be. No, it's impossible. That particular trait died out hundreds of years ago. Orochimaru's experiments couldn't even get it to work. Danzo was left to his rambling as he reached out a hand and withdrew chakra from the seal on the wall, diminishing its glow, and reducing its glow. He would never realize it, but this caused him to miss out on the name of the person whom he was thinking about at that very moment. In the Sandame's office, the old Sarutobi looked at Kakashi before taking a long drag on his pipe, slowly exhaling, the smoke puffing out in lilting lazy rings. Kakashi made no motion of any sort, his body in his standard lackadaisical slouch, his single visible eye lightly drooping downwards. Sarutobi cleared his throat before speaking. Now, I'm sure you're wondering why I mentioned the Reikuri and Chidori. Kakashi only offered a nod as his reply. Well, I do not want you teaching Naruto the Chidori or the Reikuri. At this, Kakashi's visible eye widened. What? But, why not Hokage-sama? Even though Naruto doesn't have the Sharingan, he has more than enough chakra, and his use of cage bunchins as shields and scouts makes up for his lack of the Sharingan. Sarutobi lightly pulled on his pipe, staying calm. Simply put, Kakashi, the Reikuri and Chidori are not assassination techniques. I have long contested you categorizing them as such. Kakashi nodded. The Sandame had never agreed with him calling the two techniques assassination techniques. And why not Hokage-sama? They are intended to act as a one-hit kill move. Their power and speed surely classifies them as assassination jutsu. The Sandame just shook his head. Kakashi, as a prodigy, had never wanted to admit that he was wrong, and would do everything in his power possible to prove that he was indeed right. Tell me, Kakashi, your technique is named Chidori, 1000 birds, due to the massive chirping sound it makes, no? Kakashi nodded. It was a well-known fact that concentrated lightning chakra that had yet to be molded, such as the Chidori, fired off miniature lightning bolts, that when they struck particles in the air, created a sound similar to that of a lightning bolt striking the ground, only much smaller. Then if it makes such a distinctive, loud and recognizable sound, why is it classified as an assassination? Anyone who heard the noise would instantly know what it was, not to mention its volume. Kakashi nodded under the Sandame's evidence. He had never truly considered the implications of using the jutsu, just the effects that it caused. Are you Hokage-sama? Perhaps he could use them under other situations? The Sandame chewed on the end of his pipe for a moment. I wish for you to teach him the theory and applications behind the Reikuri. I believe Naruto could learn greatly from the usage of elemental manipulation. I also wish for you to work with him on his elemental alignments. I have a suspicion that he is primarily a wind alignment, but he may have a budding water alignment. Considering his heritage, they do not surprise me. Kakashi nodded. And you hope to add lightning to his elemental repertoire before he becomes old enough that it completely solidifies? The Sandame nodded. He should be old enough that none of his other alignments shouldn't be affected by more training. Kakashi agreed. Naruto was at a delicate stage where in his development where he could add more elemental alignments if he practiced them enough, but they wouldn't overwhelm his natural alignments. What neither of the two knew was Naruto had indeed been a natural wind and water alignment in his previous life. Nor did they understand that the Kyuubi had been a fire and earth alignment, and being sealed inside of Naruto passed that trait on. The two were in for quite the surprise when Kakashi began developing Naruto's lightning affinity. What no one knew, not even Naruto, was that with elemental alignment of the 5 primary elements, special abilities were unlocked. The Kyuubi knew of the main one, but had always neglected to inform Naruto of the fact that it existed as he never developed a lightning affinity. That ability was simply known as elemental combination. And through all of this, Danzo missed the name used, and the major facts discussed. However, a rude operative in Anbu who was stationed outside of the Hokage's office heard some of the conversation. However, he once again missed the name that was used, and only learned of his, hopeful, third alignment. He had to wait several hours before he would be able to deliver the information to Danzo, and in that time, he would be focused on remembering the specific details. Wind, water and lightning were a deadly combination after all. Naruto's head was throbbing. He could feel a massive migraine coming on, and the Kyuubi's chakra wasn't making much of a dent in it just yet. He gritted his teeth as his ears were assaulted by loud yelling. Yosh, Guy-sensei, it seems I was wrong. I have not killed a small child. His youth was so powerful it deflected the brunt of the force. He is truly a formidable boy. The boy was ranting and just wouldn't be quiet. Naruto, doing the one thing he could think of at the time to shut him up, aimed his foot at the source of the voice, and swung his leg in an arc. Now, Naruto's aim was fairly accurate. However, he had forgotten that his legs were now shorter. So, instead of reaching the desired height and impacting the source of the voice, he instead hit something, or more correctly, someone else. Child-san, it is most unyouthful to kick Neji-san in the face. I must inquire as to why you would perform such an action knowing how unyouthful it was. Naruto's mind instantly kicked into overdrive. Neji? But Neji's dead. I saw him die. An image flashed before Naruto's eyes, blocking out whatever pain he was feeling and whatever he was seeing. Instead, the image filled his mind. A burning field filled with hundreds of bodies. The stench of burnt flesh and hair permeated the very atmosphere, burning his lungs with every sickening breath. A figure stood in front of him. It opened its mouth and laughed. Another figure lunged at it. He was hitting him again and again, but the sickening laughter continued. It filled his ears with ringing, and his throat and his nose burned with the acrid smoke filling the field. The figure raised a blade of some sort, and brought it down upon the other figure. He licked the blade afterwards. He slowly tapped it against his neck once or twice, testing the fallen figure's reaction. Shrugging, the maniacal laughter started once more. He swung the blade. Again, and again. The blood flew into the air, barely visible amongst the smoke and burning skies. The figure turned towards him. It licked his lips as it approached him. He opened his mouth, to cry, to yell, to speak, but nothing came. The figure stood above him now. It bent down and his cracked, bleeding lips began to move as the figure spoke to him. The Hyuga wasn't much of a challenge. Perhaps he will be? As he started to laugh, blood spitting from his mouth, landing on his face, a large glowing blue blade appeared in his chest. Turning around, standing behind him, his arm extended, was Hyuga Neji. The ultimate Jukin strike, sword of the Tenketsu. The figure choked and coughed and collapsed on the blade, motionless and lifeless. Neji gave a small smile and he began to slightly relax. He tried to yell out to Neji as the figure's eyes opened once more, but his voice still wouldn't work. The blade swung once more, and Neji was left clasping his hand to his neck as the blood slowly pooled around him. He shuddered and gasped for a few seconds, but eventually fell still. A few seconds passed while the man smirked while examining the hole in his chest. Suddenly, a loud roar filled the field. He looked up, and his eyes widened in fear. It was the first time in many years they had, and it was the last time they ever would. Hold him down, Neji, keep your hands on his head. Tenten, don't let go of his arm just yet. He seems to be calming down. Excuse me, are you alright? Naruto opened his eyes, gasping for air, sweat beading his forehead, eyes darting every which way as he slowly realized where he was. Guy-san? What happened? Guy stood up from his position, kneeling next to him, motioning for Neji to let go of his head. You began to convulse and seize. We don't know what happened exactly. We feared Lee's kick to your head may have destroyed your youthfulness. But when you awoke, we were overjoyed and filled with your overflowing youth to know that you were fine. But then you kicked Neji in the head, which Lee remarked was quite unyouthful. Then, you froze for a moment, then you began to spasm. We held you down in an effort to lessen your self-injury. Naruto blinked as he listened. Lee's kick had disoriented him. He had forgotten his situation. Neji was alive and well here. And unfortunately, he was still probably a huge ass. Naruto suddenly started laughing. He laughed because he imagined Neji's face on a fat mule. Naruto's laughter spread throughout the group, as he was followed closely by Lee and Guy. Tenten couldn't but start laughing while Neji crossed his arms and turned his nose up at them. It would have looked better if he didn't have a large black and blue mark forming on his chin. As it was now, well, it looked like the Hyuga was growing a very splotchy colored beard. The image just made Naruto laugh more. Neji didn't know what he was laughing at, but he couldn't help but start laughing, however slightly, to himself. After Team Guy and Naruto had calmed down from their laughing fit, or in Neji's case, chuckles, Guy decided to find out exactly what had happened to cause Naruto to enter their training field and to seemingly attack Neji. "Excuse me, but what is your purpose here? It is not often that a young ninja trainee wanders into a shinobi training field." Naruto was irked that Guy thought he was only a trainee. He was wearing the official Konoha headband after all. "I am not a trainee. I'm a fully trained, fully fledged genin tier shinobi of Konohagakure." Guy looked at him for a moment before laughing. "You are much too young to be a shinobi. You look only 10, and will not graduate the academy for another 2 years. Although you are bursting with youth, even my team, the most youthful of all, has only just become a genin team." His team nodded. This had been their first team meeting. "I look 10, because I am 10. They all looked at him and blinked. "I successfully completed the criteria for early graduation." Guy looked at him before beaming a huge smile while forming the good guy pose. "Yosh, I can see your youth knows no bounds. Now, who are your youthful teammates?" Naruto unwittingly took a slight step backwards. He never remembered this side of Guy. He chose the more serious, while still kind-hearted version, who would not come around until the war. "Actually, I don't have any teammates. I was placed under Hitaki Kakashi as his apprentice." Guy paused, and blinked for a moment. "My eternal rival Kakashi has taken on an apprentice who graduated early from the academy." Naruto nodded slowly, trying not to draw attention to himself. "You must be entirely consumed by the flames of youth to have graduated so early. Now, what is it that your youthful spirit yearns for?" Guy gave the good guy pose, his arm extended giving a thumbs up and a bright smile. His teeth gave off a ping of light. Naruto just shook it off with a shiver. "I came to see if perhaps you could help me with physical conditioning. I am currently in a fairly poor physical state, and it is important for a shinobi to be good physical and mental condition." Naruto had long doubted his mental condition because of all the things he had endured. A flash of a corpse flew through his mind unwillingly. This one was clad in a green spandex outfit. Its limbs were gone, each one in no fewer than 3 pieces laying around it. Its jaw was removed, the tongue hanging limply on top of the blood-soaked throat, the jaw embedded into its stomach. Its face was burning, the flesh blackening and curling, the smell permeating the air. Naruto shook his head to rid himself of the image of Guy's corpse. Guy was in front of him now, alive and well. He knew he had to give up those memories, to some degree, or they would continue to haunt him, but he didn't want to surrender completely to his younger mind. Finally deciding he would think about it later, he turned back to Guy. "Why would you come asking another teacher for help? Surely you can ask Kakashi for help regarding your physical health. Besides, is it not against policy to ask another teacher for help? And wouldn't my training take up too much time that could be better devoted to Kakashi's training?" Naruto nodded. Guy had made several good points. Because Guy-san, Kakashi's specialty is ninjutsu and genjutsu. He is not much of a physical specialist at all. Also, Kakashi is officially listed as my mentor, not my Junin teacher. Besides, Kakashi is 3 hours late to any appointment that isn't urgent. I could use those 3 hours to attend to any physical regimen you may decide to prepare for me, Guy-san." Guy nodded. "It is decided then. I will devise a training schedule for you. You will also be an excellent sparring partner for my youthful students. With work, you could become as good at taijutsu as Lee." At this comment, Lee jumped up yelling his sensei's name. Guy cheered Lee's name back. This continued several times before they began to hug and the image of a sunset seemed to appear behind them. Naruto rubbed his eyes and it faded away, but he could have sworn it was real. Naruto backed away from the 2 taijutsu enthusiasts. He didn't want to be hanging around them while they were acting this way. He kept walking backwards until he was out of the training ground. Neji and Tenten were both shaking their heads at their teammates' actions. They weren't at all surprised that Naruto had left very few people could handle their teammates. Kakashi stood inside of a bookstore. In front of him was a large bookshelf. It was orange and color was covered in the words, Icha Icha. All the books were wrapped in a black plastic cover. The covering had white words naming each book. Kakashi carefully selected one. He pulled it off the shelf with the utmost care. He slid his hands over the covering. Hearing the crackle, he smiled. He selected another from the shelf and felt it in his hand. Giving a slight frown, he shook his head and placed it back on the shelf. He reached for a second one before pausing. He frowned deeply and shook his head. He reached for another one, and when his hand touched it, he grinned. He quickly pulled it off the shelf and turned to leave. He paused when he saw who was standing there. Kakashi's old teammate, Inuzuka Rin, was standing with her arms crossed as Kakashi selected his literature. He took on a look of surprise when he noticed Rin. "Oh, hello Rin, I didn't expect to see you here. What's new?" Kakashi smiled at her. Rin couldn't help but chuckle and smile back. "Not much, Kakashi. I see you still make your selections with the utmost care. Any particular reason this time?" Kakashi nodded. "They've released several Icha Icha versions with illustrations by the author. I had to make sure the ones I chose contained those extra illustrations." Rin raised an eyebrow at his explanation. "And how do you determine which of these contain the illustrations?" Kakashi just smiled. "Simple. I've memorized the weight of every single Icha Icha volume to be released to date. So, I've taught myself to weigh any item I'm holding in order to determine if it contains any additional pages or ink markings." Kakashi smiled again while Rin just sighed. Rin reached behind Kakashi, glanced at the shelf for a moment before pulling off two of the books. Kakashi glanced at the covers for a moment. Volumes 37 and 38. Those were quite good. Rin just smiled. "I've fallen behind and had to catch up. They don't stock Icha Icha books in Kusa, so I was unable to pick them up." Kakashi nodded. Rin had been undercover for about 7 months now, and had just been recalled. "Wait till you reach volume 41. Kakashi giggled and blushed as he thought of the book. Rin just shook her head. "You're way too addicted to these books, Kakashi. I agree, they are very well structured, and their characters are amazingly lifelike, but the scenes are amazingly improbable." Kakashi waggled his eyebrows at Rin. "Do you want to test that theory?" Rin just laughed and punched Kakashi's shoulder. "Kakashi, how many times do I have to tell you, I'm not interested in you like that?" Kakashi nodded. He was never really serious about chasing after Rin. Obito had been, and for a time, Kakashi was too. But over time, he had drifted away from serious romance. His constant reading of his Icha Icha books was a way for him to escape from the reality of the romance. The truth was Kakashi was afraid of most serious commitment. That was why he failed any team that he was previously assigned. His stint in Anbu was his way of distancing himself from real people. But now, he had an apprentice who he didn't really have a choice to fail or not. Kakashi shook his head. He didn't know if he could handle that responsibility or not. "Kakashi, Kakashi, are you listening to me?" Kakashi snapped out of his reverie and looked over at Rin. "You were ignoring me." Kakashi just scratched the back of his head nervously. "I was thinking about some things." Rin nodded and Kakashi gave a relieved sigh. "As I was saying, what's this that I've heard of you taking on an apprentice?" Kakashi looked at Rin. Was it really traveling around that fast? "The Hokage wants me to take an apprentice and train him to be an assassination specialist. He also doesn't want me teaching him the Chidori or Reikuri." Kakashi seemed disappointed that he wouldn't be able to pass on his personal techniques. "At least someone finally told you those techniques of yours are absolutely terrible for assassination. The boy wouldn't be able to use them anyways. You need the Sharingan for them to work properly." Kakashi nodded weakly. He had known that it required the Sharingan. He had hoped that he would be able to pass the technique on to his children. The little-known truth was that after Rin, Kakashi had fallen in love once more. Her name was Uchiha Sukiakara, Moonlight. She had been the love of Kakashi's life, and he had been planning to drop out of Anbu and become a regular Junin to marry her. It was a week after he left Anbu when the entirety of the Uchiha clan, save Sasuke, was brutally murdered. Kakashi had never even had the chance to say goodbye. The ring he had planned to give to her still stood in a small velvet box atop a shelf in his home. A silent reminder of what was taken from him. So, who's the unlucky little bastard who'll get you as a teacher? Kakashi didn't even chuckle at Rin's attempt at humor. His name is Uzumaki Naruto. Rin stiffened slightly at the name. The Kyuubi child? Kakashi gave Rin a stern look. I'm going to pretend I didn't hear that. Because you know, under the Third's decree, if I did hear a statement like that, I would be obligated as a Konoha shinobi to kill you. Rin just slapped Kakashi's shoulder as she proceeded to the cash register and paid for her books. Kakashi followed behind her likewise. Oh, lay off it, Kakashi. There aren't any Anbu members around, neither is the kid. Anyone here already knows what happened that October 10th. It isn't like the Third actually enforces that silly little decree. But really, the QO, excuse me, Uzumaki, brat? He isn't anything special. I've seen him before. If he amounts to anything, it won't actually be on his own merit. Kid's too dense for anything other than a stand owner. Kakashi was gaping behind his mask. He hadn't known Rin to be such a cold and uncaring person. He shook his head. Yes, he showed considerable skill during his genin test. He actually managed to graduate 2 full years early. He'll go far. He's built for assassination. Rin just waved her hand at him. Sure, whatever you say, Kashi. I got to go. I'll speak with you later. Kakashi nodded as Rin waved goodbye and walked away from the bookstore. If Kakashi had been paying attention, he may have noticed the wind ruffle Rin's sleeve just enough to catch a glimpse of a tree tattooed onto Rin's arm. Rin walked down the streets barely paying attention to the things around her. Her smile and cheerful attitude were gone. In their place was a face of cold hard determination. She entered the red light district of Konoha, a slummy sleazy part of town tucked into the darkest dankest corners of the city. Large neon signs flashed dizzying words and images. Women coaxed in men from the doorways. Rin almost sneered at the number of people that were here in the middle of the day. She walked through the neon maze of brick and mortar, the blinding flashes sparking everywhere. Screams and shrieks echoed across the dark blood-stained streets as more flowed into the gutters. An arm fell limp and was dragged into the darkness of an alleyway. A woman escorted a man to his hotel room, undoing his tie. He would awake to find his money and valuable possessions missing. He would scream in mental anguish before heading back to the district to hunt down the seductress. On his way in, he would be snagged and pulled into an alleyway. A meal for some back alley slumwalker who could tell you by the thickness of the grease and blood on a diner floor which diner it was. Rin walked by a diner, red slowly seeping under its doorway. It opened to reveal a large man carrying a dark mop pushing the blood out into the street. If you asked, it was pig's blood from the butcher shop in the back that had a clogged drain. But anyone who was poor enough, or greasy enough, or enough of a back alley trader to have eaten there would tell you it was too tough and too stringy to be pork. People disappeared in the red light district every day. It was Konoha's disgusting secret. Every village had a place similar, but only Konoha's had grown so large and fat that it was beyond the grasp of the law. As she walked, a hand lurched from behind a wall attempting to grab Rin. A flash of light later and it withdrew with a shriek of hand, the first joint of its fingers laying on the ground. Rin approached a particularly sleazy diner and opened the door. Inside stood a thin, wiry man wiping his hands on a brown cloth. His teeth were rotted and yellow, and his hair wiry and gray. His smock was spattered with blood and dirt. He glanced at Rin. I suppose you'll be taking the special again? She merely nodded. Alrighty then. Bark rot soup comin' right up. He ducked behind the counter grumbling about not being able to find a bowl. Be a dear and go in the back and fetch a clean pot, will ya? I'm fresh out up here. Rin nodded once more, walking through the swinging door that led to the kitchen. Once inside, she walked over to the wall that held the shelf that held the pots. Pulling one off the wall turned with a groan to reveal a dark passageway. Rin entered and replaced the pot through a piece of wall that could be removed. The wall swung back and melded seamlessly into the grease pit. It was Konoha's best-kept secret. Their disgusting blood works. Their prostitute rings and murder shops. Their red light district. The place where the Root Anbu headquarters was located. Danzo sat in his small underground office. An odd moss growing around the room provided the only dim illumination. He sat slightly hunched over, his cane leaning against the desk. He shuffled a few papers before sighing. He was waiting for his informant to arrive. He looked up quickly as the door creaked and swung open. He watched impassively as the figure of Inuzuka Rin entered. During Rin's undercover mission to Kusa, a root member had caught her. He had placed a seal at the base of her skull. A seal that sent chakra strings into the spinal cord. The seal was a puppeteer seal. It allowed the user to take complete control of something, usually people. The unfortunate thing was that people had a pesky habit of resisting influences. It was used on puppets for a while, but since the seal required a consciousness to inhabit the body, puppeteers became incredibly easy prey while they controlled their singular puppet. However, Danzo had utilized the seal on Rin's body and had a root agent located somewhere in his HQ always operating as Rin. He had been controlling the seal for so long, he no longer thought of himself as who he was, he had become Rin. Danzo looked at his Rin puppet. When he looked closely enough he could see a spark of the old Rin deep within the body. He gave a small laugh as he stroked Rin's face, watching the minuscule muscle twitches indicating she wanted to jerk away from him. Danzo just chuckled and took his seat once more. He looked once more at the puppet. Rin, what do you have to report to me? The controller instantly fell into root mode. I've discovered the name of the child being placed under Hitaki Kakashi. The child's name is Uzumaki Naruto, and they intend to train him as an assassination specialist. Danzo nearly choked when he heard the name. Are you sure you heard the name right? He wasn't taking any chances. Yes, Danzo-sama, I spoke with Hitaki Kakashi personally and he mentioned him by name. The root member didn't find it important to mention the fact that Kyuubi child had slipped. That was not something root members said. He had been trained to report only what he was supposed to, which led to some better reports concerning details, but concerning details not pertaining directly to the mission, everything was lost. Leave me, I need time to think about this. The root member nodded and bowed. He stepped back through the door, falling back into the character of Rin. Danzo stared at the large seal on his wall. So, it's the Kyuubi brat that's being trained by Hitaki. He would have made an excellent root member, but he's far too headstrong. But if he's the one who has wind and water affinities, and they're training his lightning affinity. Danzo suddenly sat upright in his chair. His visible eye was twitching slightly, and the bandages over his other eye seemed to twitch in anticipation. The Kyuubi was water, fire, and earth aligned. That means the boy's water affinity will match if not outdo his primary wind affinity. And with fire and earth, Danzo's face paled. He would be aligned to all 5 elements. Danzo had never heard of someone having all 5 elemental affinities. The last person to do so was the 6 Paths Sage, and the power he wielded was absolutely enormous. He gripped the table and turned up his listening seal. This could be a bigger wrench in his plans than he had previously expected. Danzo let out a sigh as he turned to the seal and listened. The sound of a brush flitting lightly over paper calmed Danzo down as it always did, and he could almost rely on Sarutobi to either be painting or discussing important matters. Sarutobi sat behind his desk, his brush deftly swirling across the scroll in front of him. He gave a small smirk as every couple of strokes he would make one on his desk. It was more of an experiment than anything else. If it worked he would carve it into his desk permanently. He chuckled as he looked at the small glowing seal on his desk. How much of a naive Hokage do you take me for, Danzo? I've been in this office for over 30 years and you think a seal carved into my desk would go unnoticed? Sarutobi was hoping to reverse engineer the seal so that it would give him insight into wherever it was Danzo kept the receiver seal. Sarutobi looked at the scroll that he was writing. It was a message to Kakashi. It was written to be delivered once Sarutobi died. In the scroll he was leaving his most important messages. He was leaving the secret of Naruto's heritage to Kakashi. He glanced up at the picture of the Yondaime on the wall as it stared him down. He took a deep breath before continuing to write. He knew the Yondaime would be disappointed in him for informing Naruto so late in his life. 10 years without knowing who his parents were. The Yondaime's face stared him down continually and he sighed before thinking to himself. What would you have me do, Minato? You know who Naruto's parents were. You knew them far better than I ever did. I can't go spouting off who they were. Naruto's life is in enough danger already. I don't need him running off to find his heritage. Sarutobi slowly wrote the last few lines of the note before sealing it with a blood seal that would not disappear until his death. He moved a small panel on his desk before swiping his blood across a hidden seal. A small door appeared. He opened the door and slipped the scroll inside before closing the door and swiping his blood across the seal once more, causing the door to disappear. He remembered the last few lines of his note. Kakashi. If Naruto heads for Kusa or Nami to rediscover his heritage, go with him. What awaits him there is not of a kind or friendly nature. Sarutobi closed his eyes and remembered his excursions to Kusa and Nami when he was much younger. He hadn't known it then, but he had met Naruto's ancestors. Their secrets were so jealously guarded that it was suicide for someone of even his caliber to chase after them. But Naruto was only a 10-year-old boy. What would he know of his parents? Sarutobi didn't know it at the time, but his note that he left since Naruto was becoming an apprentice would cause ripples throughout the shinobi world. Sarutobi had just taken the butterfly effect, smacked the butterfly out of the way and started waving a fan. As Sarutobi closed his eyes and leaned back, he heard a slight grumbling and then quiet shouting. He immediately sat up and pressed his ear to the seal he had drawn. He could hear Danzo yelling at someone about messing up the new recruit's emotional desensitization training. He grinned before pulling out a small knife. He had some adjustments to make. Naruto lay in his bed in his apartment staring at the ceiling. He would meet Kakashi the next day for his day of training with the smut-nosed shinobi. He had no idea what was in store for him this time around. He had still been in the Shinobi Academy at this age in his last life. That was such an odd and foreign thought for him. He let his hand fall limply by his side where his swords used to lay. He frowned as he remembered the familiar weight of his zanbatsu. He had started off with just a standard zanbatsu, but it hadn't been anywhere near the quality that he had needed. He had eventually returned to Wave to claim Zabuza's Kabikuri Hucho. However, he had discovered that an odd boy with the ability to transform into water had taken it. His name was Suigetsu. In his anger, Naruto slaughtered Suigetsu and claimed Zabuza's zanbatsu, which Suigetsu had kept in good condition. Naruto never felt remorse about slaying Suigetsu. He had robbed Zabuza's grave, whereas Naruto was merely returning to claim his spoils of war. He also felt the lack of weight from his katana. It hadn't been anything particularly special, but it held a special place with Naruto. And lastly came the light swinging weight of the hilt that used to hang on his belt. He didn't know where it was, but he knew where it would be in 5 years. It was Konoha's hereditary blade, the Raijin, stolen by the A-rank missing Nin Rokusho Aoi. He rolled over and stared at the wall. Kakashi was a terrible teacher to him the last time around. But now, with Kakashi's full attention, and his knowledge of his past life, Naruto swore he would change things. The images of his dying friends flashed through his mind once more, only this time there was more. Amid the visions of his friends' bodies burning, dismembered and bloody, there was a new face. The last face that passed into his vision was one that wasn't dismembered, it wasn't bloody nor was it dismembered. Yet this face brought a tear to his face. He had done so much for him. As Naruto closed his eyes and drifted into sleep, the image of the Kyuubi no Kitsune flashed in his mind. As he drifted further and further into sleep, he shed a tear just for the Kyuubi. And just as he was on the precipice of sleep, a voice rang through his mind. The hell? Naruto immediately shot up in bed. He spoke aloud to himself as if to assure himself that it was just one big hallucination. Kyuubi? To his surprise and astonishment, he was answered. Kit, what the hell happened? Why am I back here? Naruto couldn't answer Kyuubi. All he could do was blink his eyes in astonishment. The Sandaime Hokage grinned as he began writing in a long scroll. He had finally been able to start compiling evidence against Danzo. However, routing Danzo from Konoha and destroying all remnants of Root would be an immensely difficult task. It would take careful planning and even more careful execution. Sarutobi ran his hand over the desk and Danzo's quiet talking filled his office. He was discussing orders with a Root member who was being sent as an undercover agent to Iwa. Sarutobi listened as he instructed him to meet up with the other Root plants. It was here that Sarutobi learned of a greatly kept secret. Iwa was the most unfortunate of all the 5 great countries. They had just instated their Rokudame Tsuchikage. No other great country had had so many cages. But what Sarutobi overheard was most distressing. Iwa's Sandaime Tsuchikage, a short and old, but extremely powerful shinobi, had been assassinated by one of Danzo's Root members. The Yondaime Tsuchikage was a root plant sent there specifically to use Iwa for whatever reason was necessary. However, the Yondaime Tsuchikage was quickly, and very quietly, removed from office. In his place rose the Godem Tsuchikage. Danzo, displeased with the fact that the Godem Tsuchikage was more peace-loving than the former Tsuchikages, ordered him to be assassinated. However, in the midst of the assassination attempt, the assassin was murdered. Then the Rokudame Tsuchikage rose to power. No one really knew what he looked like. When he appeared in the morning, the Godame's body hanging bleeding and dismembered from the Tsuchikage's tower, he was wearing a large straw hat. His body was covered in a bulky robe. His voice was soothing and a mellow baritone. He had followed the tradition of new Tsuchikages by accepting any challenger who wishes to contend for the title of Rokudame Tsuchikage. Every challenger lasted no more than 30 seconds. No one knew exactly how he did it, but the new Tsuchikage killed them with disturbing ease. The medical shinobi determined that all 7 challengers died because of a burst heart. The Rokudame had gone unquestioned from that point onwards. The Rokudame quickly set about to transform Iwa from the poor agricultural society it was, into a powerhouse. Iwagakure was hardly anything like a shinobi village. It was ramshackle huts and lean-tos built crudely out of earth and stone and what little wood could be found in the barren lands of Iwa. The Rokudame transformed the Tsuchikage Tower first. It went from a small 3-story building to a towering stone monolith. It was humongous. Its base spread nearly 5 times what Konoha's Hokage Tower did. The Rokudame then built it upward, several hundred feet into the sky. He purposefully modeled it after the Hokage Tower. He was using their hatred of Konoha to fuel their pride. The Tsuchikage then began greatly expanding Iwagakure by annexing small villages that lived just at its edges. He then began constructing enormous walls around the newly enlarged city. He split the city into 4 sections. The northern quarter was the market quarter where all shops and vendors were located. The west quarter was the shinobi residential quarter. It was similar to the east quarter, which was the civilian residential quarter. They both housed all of their respective kind. The southern quarter was the industrial quarter. Iwa was at the forefront of metal smelting due to the enormous ore deposits located in their mountains. The industrial sector was filled with refineries, forges, and blacksmiths constantly pouring out metal works. The Rokudame located the Ninja Academy 3 miles to the south of Iwagakure. It was less of a school and more of a compound where all prospective shinobi lived and trained before becoming genin. The Rokudame was ruthless when routing all crime in the city. The first thing he did was removing any resembling a red light district. There were still sales of alcoholic beverages in the market sector, but no bars or stalls where one could sit and drink. Food vendors were allowed, but the primary item had to be food. Anyone attempting to bypass these laws simply disappeared, and their lot auctioned off to prospective owners. Instead, the Rokudame instituted a new idea. He created multiple red cities. Red cities were clusters of business, bars, brothels, hot springs, and the like. These cities were filled with alcohol and, however, they were amazingly well policed. The red cities were the Rokudame's way of rewarding shinobi. After completing a number of missions, they were given a stay in a red city. The number of missions and their rank equated to how many days they were given. Since the cities were populated by shinobi, prostitutes, and bar owners, fights occasionally broke out. In one instance, a shinobi attacked a prostitute who was off duty for not submitting to him. He attempted to rape her, but was stopped before he had even reached her. The other shinobi in the town greatly respected everyone who ran the red cities and despised anyone who harmed them. They worked for their stay, and wouldn't let some stupid ruffian screw it up. In effect, the visitors of the red cities were its police force. The Rokudame also set about extending more opportunity to the poorer farmers spread out in Iwa. He offered them chances to send their children to the Shinobi Academy or to become workers in the industrial sector. Those who stayed as farmers were visited by genin as D-rank missions to teach them to use simple Doden jutsu to plant and plow more quickly and to improve crop yield. Overall, the Rokudame Tsuchikage was quickly transforming Iwa from a poor rundown country devastated by the loss of the Second Great Shinobi War 15 years earlier, into a major powerhouse in just 13 years. Danzo, however, was displeased with how much control the Tsuchikage was taking in Iwa and sent his route to assassinate him. However, his Anbu were quickly killed, and once the Rokudame made them the focus of his attention, the other plants were quickly found and executed. That had been 2 years ago, and now Danzo was attempting to re-establish his connections in Iwa, but was having very little success. This news troubled Sarutobi. They hadn't heard of any of this. To the knowledge of most of the world, the Sandame Tsuchikage still held power. However, Danzo's inside information proved that false. Sarutobi quickly wrote down all that he had heard Danzo tell his new plant. He shook his head for the poor lad. There was no way he would make it into Iwa, and then back out alive if this Rokudame Tsuchikage was as powerful as he seemed. Unfortunately, he had no other sources of information. Sarutobi sighed as he unsealed the secret cupboard once more, placing the scroll inside. Iwa becoming such a powerhouse was indeed a large problem, but Sarutobi had the feeling that there were underlying motives to this Rokudame's actions. Danzo was making a huge mistake. His motives were far too obvious. He wished to infiltrate Iwa and take over. But this Rokudame Tsuchikage, he improved Iwa. He didn't just produce a huge military force and use it to wage war. He was building a force that was more than just mere military. He wasn't building an army, he was building a country. Naruto was walking towards Training Ground 9, his mind in a jumble. His mind flashed back to the previous night when Kyuubi had suddenly reappeared. Flashback. Naruto sat upright in his bead, unable to comprehend the fact that the Kyuubi was once sealed within him. Kyuubi, is that really you, or am I just suffering from hallucinations caused by this whole time travel ordeal? An echoing laugh resounded throughout his head. I'm as real as they come, kid. Although why they come back after sacrificing themselves, and confining themselves to an eternity in hell to give you another chance to fix everything you screwed over the first time is still a mystery. Naruto couldn't believe it. Kyuubi was actually alive, and ungrateful as ever. Don't get me wrong, boy, I am not, nor have I ever been ungrateful. I was sitting down in hell, bit of a nasty place, for barely a year, and suddenly I'm back here, once more located within your gut. Although it's no longer a sewer, which is a nice aesthetic change. Kyuubi, that still doesn't even begin to explain why you're here. And, you're you. You're not the Kyuubi was from when I was 10 years old. Kyuubi just laughed at Naruto. Of course I'm not. You see, all divine beings, regardless of them being evil or good in the eyes of existence, exist in a continuous strain. If one version of us in a dimension dies, all other versions do too. Not in the same way perhaps, but they do. So, when I confined myself to hell, I effectively ended every single universe besides the one to which I transported you. Naruto was gaping at what the Kyuubi was telling him. You mean, we're single-handedly responsible for the deaths of everyone and everything? Naruto was getting pretty depressed over this whole thing. No, they simply ceased to exist outside this singular universe. And they all ended because they all collided at a singular point. When every single universe matches up with the others, the dominant universe begins the universe of origin. The universe from which all others will spring. Also, the rules in the universe of origin are slightly bent compared to the others. Bent in what ways? Well, you brought me back somehow. Since this is the universe of origin, I was able to come back, and all the other universes are now gone. However, the universes are once multiplying to infinity. This conversation has already spawned trillions upon trillions of universes. Any minute difference anywhere in the world causes another universe to split off. Kyuubi, you're kinda starting to get all confusing and philosophical and whatnot. You're 26 years old, kid. You should be able to understand it. But regardless, what did you do to bring me back? Naruto thought for a minute, before he realized what might have caused it. Kyuubi, if this is the universe of origin, is it at all possible that gods could interfere with it? Kyuubi thought for a moment. Yes, it is very possible. But, I'm a Biju of the highest ranking. They've been trying to confine me to hell for years, but they've never succeeded. I've always managed to avoid it. They never expected me to go there of my own free will. It was a nice change, but it gets boring very quickly. Kyuubi, is there any way that a demon can permanently escape hell? Kyuubi blinked before thinking for a long time. He slowly began to respond. Yes, I've heard of a way. Although to my incredibly extensive knowledge no demon has ever been able to accomplish it. Naruto nodded slowly. And what is this way? It is simply, to be loved. Naruto blinked. I don't expect you to understand. Demons are demons. We cannot show each other love. We know only what is shown to us. What we are given. Demons are born without emotion. We quickly learn hate and anger from other demons, which stems from the rejection we were shown by humans when we first arrived. We've developed cunning, happiness, greed, and nearly every other emotion, except for love. No human being has ever shown a demon love. Humans have made pacts with demons, but no human has ever actually truly admitted in their hearts, in a way that is undeniable before even the gods. When they admit it, they create a bond between them that is unbreakable, and they are drawn together for eternity. Kyuubi, I think that might be what happened. I was thinking of all my friends last night. And, you were the last one to come to my mind. The Kyuubi blinked at the admission. That would do it, kid. Congratulations. You've become the first person who has ever loved a demon, and the first person to ever pull someone or something out of hell. And the only person to rewrite which universe was the universe of origin. Naruto smiled. He now had a friend who had been with him from the beginning. He smiled as he drifted off into sleep finally. Never contemplating exactly what Kyuubi meant when it spoke of love. The Kyuubi sighed as it settled into its former place in Naruto's mind. However, as he watched, the seal seemed to dissipate ever so slightly, causing Kyuubi to blink. Even the Yondaime's seal can't overcome the power of love. The Kyuubi snorted. How cliché. The Kyuubi settled in for a night of rest, taking his mind off of the seal in front of him that slowly began to deteriorate quicker as Kyuubi descended into sleep. End flashback. Naruto arrived at Training Ground 9 at approximately 8 o'clock in the morning. Much to his chagrin, Kakashi hadn't arrived yet. He most likely would arrive somewhere around 9. Naruto sighed and stretched out on the grass watching clouds drift by. He closed his eyes and breathed in the lightly scented air. He allowed the sun to warm him to his bones, and enjoyed this moment. For years he had been surrounded by death and destruction, and the only warmth he had received was from the blood that coated him as he cut down hordes of enemies aiming for Akatsuki. As he settled into the grass, the grumbling voice in the back of his mind revived itself once more. What do you suppose your training is going to entail this time around, kid? And who's on your team? Not those disgusting brats Pinky and Duck. Naruto chuckled at the Kyuubi's references to Sasuke and Sakura. I don't have a team this time around, Kyuubi. I've been assigned Kakashi as a mentor this time. Probably as a combat specialist. Makes sense considering my enormous chakra reserves. But now that I have you back now, Kyuubi, my chakra will most likely be very recognizable. The Kyuubi nodded for a moment before coughing. That's very interesting. I never figured the Hitaki for a combat specialist mentor. Shows how much I know about how you ninja think. And, kid, there's something you need to know. Naruto listened. I don't have my chakra anymore. Naruto's face became one of shock and horror. What do you mean you don't have your chakra anymore? You're back, aren't you? Kyuubi nodded. Yes. But the time travel technique consumed the majority of it in my resurrection to this dimension. One where I previously was non-existent, my chakra was near to non-existent, and as such the dimensional transfer eliminated it completely. However, the chakra used to send you here. Some of it was absorbed by you, and as such increased your chakra capacity. Naruto ran his hand through his hair while sighing. Damn, so I have even more chakra? The Kyuubi simply nodded. How much of a difference is that going to make in the long run? The Kyuubi thought for a moment. Considering you don't have all of it yet, not a lot. Your body can't handle the chakra of 8 tails of a Biju. Your chakra will increase at a quicker pace than a normal shinobi, but you won't become a chakra god until you reach the physical capability where your body could handle 8 tails of chakra without any negative repercussions. I'm sure you remember the last time you went 8 tails. Naruto did indeed remember the last time he had gone 8 tails. It had been when he was training to face Uchiha Madara. He had become a furless fox. It was a gruesome sight, and an even more gruesome thing to be. He never wanted to turn into that thing again. But the power he had felt was enormous. He could feel the air responding to the chakra floating off of him. The water quivered at his presence. The dirt shivered and seemingly floated closer to him. The temperature rose and sparks burst around him. Electricity had crackled across his exposed muscle. It was a magnificent feeling. If he could be like that all the time, which in reality would be around the time he could handle 4 tails. Then when he hit 8 tails, it would be twice that. The power would be nearly uncontrollable. You've got a long way to go. You could hardly even handle a full tail's worth in your past life when Duck defected. By the end of that life, 2.5 at most. Naruto sighed. With that kind of improvement, he doubted he would ever make it to 8 tails. He would need the lifespan of Uchiha Madara in order to accomplish it. He could rest a little easier knowing his Moon's Eye plan would go unaccomplished. Kyuubi. I remember when I was in the 8-tailed form, the elements responded to my chakra. I know I'm water and wind affiliated, and you're fire and earth affiliated, so where does lightning come from? The Kyuubi thought for a moment. I believe it was the Raijin you wielded for so long. Its lightning powers were carried by your chakra when you wielded it, and when the chakra you supplied it was withdrawn, it carried an elemental affinity, which was eventually transferred to you. Naruto nodded. He would have to consider that more this time around. He glanced at the sun. It was getting very close to the 9. He closed his eyes and basked in the sun, the silence from Kyuubi a welcome one. He idly wondered what Kakashi would do when he arrived. He was also thinking of which excuse Kakashi would use this time around. His thoughts wandered to what Team Guy was up to at the time. Guy cheered as his team engaged in a spar. He was spouting continuously about the flames of youth and their power. However, when Lee, who was spouting the same nonsense, was knocked out by the combined power of Tenten and Neji, they turned on their sensei. Yosh, let us see if your powers of youth compare to my own. Guy may have been incredibly eccentric, but they hadn't taken into account why Guy was a Junin. The Sandame sat at his desk reading over the daily proposals. He sorted the missions into their appropriate categories, approving the application for Konoha Shinobi to be sent on it. He sighed as he filled out form after form, rejecting proposals with no merit. He sighed as he read over the Chunin exam invitation. He had rejected the proposal from 6 months ago for Konoha attending the exams in Kumo. He had been informed that Suna and Iwa had also declined the invitation. As such, the Chunin exams would commence with smaller countries and Kiri attending. Anyone promoted wouldn't be regarded as an official Chunin as they weren't approved by 3 or more of the cages. They could however be promoted internally and practice their skills with B-rank missions. The next Chunin exams would be held in Iwa. His preliminary intelligence informed him that Suna, Kiri, and Kumo were all leaning towards attending. Not wishing to appear as a weak country in front of the daimyos and other countries, Sarutobi decided he would attend. These Chunin exams would be held in 1 year, as was the case with all Chunin exam invitations. Sarutobi sighed as he counted. Konoha's turn would be approaching soon. He wished for Naruto to advance to Chunin, but he feared Iwa would be too hostile towards him. He would have to wait at least a year before he advanced. Waiting for him to participate in Konoha's Chunin exams would come off as too much favoritism, which actually wasn't unusual, but with Konoha's current reputation as a peace-loving country, favoritism provided a bad image to the daimyo. He sighed as he leaned back in his chair. Danzo hadn't made any noise for several days. He was starting to wonder what Danzo was doing. He pushed the thought out of his mind as he signed his acceptance of the Iwa Chunin exams. He then looked over the paper, one which was requesting aid in Nami to deal with common thugs. As he read it over, he noticed several details didn't add up. Something odd was going on in Nami, and he wanted to figure out what. Nami was a major seafood importer to Konoha. Sushi and fish products made up about 13% of Konoha's market. An unacceptable percentage to lose. Sarutobi signed the paper under a C-ranked mission and filed it. However, it would be a week before it was assigned. Danzo liked very few things. One of those things was good sake. Not the cheap kind you found at tea houses that Danzo described with the phrase, "This is the sake made out of the rice that was watered by the poorest piss of the poorest farmers, that only tastes anything close to something similar to sake, because the farmers got to taste the good sake before pissing on this." He liked the expensive sake. Danzo also liked power. Lots of power. But his like of power came from his love of control. Danzo had very rarely ever been in control of anything in his life. His loss of his left eye, and the majority of the control over his arm, drove Danzo to seek control over anything he could. Danzo liked the power to control. Danzo liked to swear. Whenever something went wrong, an expletive was emitted from Danzo's mouth. Danzo didn't utter them without a thought or care. He carefully planned what situation each one was to be used in. He ranked them, and he decided how he would pronounce them too. Danzo liked swearing, and he liked controlling it too. Danzo also liked pretty things. He allowed himself small bits of joy by keeping a piece of colored glass, a marble, a sake bottle, or whatever caught his fancy. Danzo was indeed an eccentric individual. Danzo liked pretty, especially shiny things. At this particular moment, Danzo was doing the third. He was swearing. He uttered expletive after expletive, each executed just how he wanted it. Why was Danzo swearing so profusely at this very moment? It was because of what he had just learned from his excursion to Kiri. His route agents there had been particularly helpful, and had informed that the current Mizukage was looking into promoting, of all people, a woman to the position of Mizukage. Contrary to what he liked, Danzo disliked many things. One of those was women. Danzo had never had any romantic success. Danzo had never had a caring mother or other womanly figure. He also saw them as weak and incompetent. This fact was why Root was primarily male. Danzo disliked women in positions of power, besides those of daimyo or others that were hereditary, as those were unavoidable, and who has he to question fate? What really set Danzo off was the Chunin exams being held in Iwa. He wished to use it as a chance to sabotage the other countries while they were inside. Sabotage in such ways that wouldn't appear for months or years. The economic and military collapse of Smoke Country, a country that had been on the rise, and in 40 years or so, could have become powerful to displace one of the Great Five and create a new power. Danzo had taken it down. The Great Five were too well established to take down, but he could cause damage. In truth, Danzo had prevented more wars than any other shinobi in history. Constant sabotage had reduced powers to the point where they refused to wage war. However, he now had no information on Iwa and they could pose a problem. So he swore. Again, Danzo stood outside the cage's office in Kiri. He took a deep breath as he prepared to enter. This was a tricky diplomatic situation, and he did not wish to endanger his life. Naruto opened his eye as the sun was blocked by something. He looked up and noticed Kakashi standing there, his eye in its distinctive smile shape. He raised his right hand in a simple gesture. Yo! Naruto sighed. Late as usual, Kakashi-sensei. Kakashi just continued to smile. So, what are we planning to start with today, sensei? Kakashi fiddled around his vest pocket for a moment before pulling out a sheet of paper. Let's start with getting to know each other. I don't have the choice to fail you, and I've been instructed to train you as an assassination specialist. I want to get to know my student this time. Naruto blinked at the unexpected announcement. Kakashi had never been this personal before. Taking a seat, Naruto began to talk. Where would you like me to start, Kakashi-sensei? Kakashi thought for a moment. I'll have time to learn your life story later, if ever. What I want to hear right now is what sort of things interest you, what sort of things you dislike, your hobbies, and the like. Naruto nodded and began describing his personality. Throughout the whole description, Kakashi sat and listened patiently. Naruto smiled as he spoke. Never before had he been so happy to tell someone about himself. Never before had anyone really cared to ask.